Welcome to Truth Meets Fiction, your home for timeless stories, unforgettable characters, and the kind of content that stays with you long after the credits roll. Whether it's fact, fiction, or somewhere in between, you'll find it here. Let's begin.
Chapter 21 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 21. Antifer and his companions left Tunis at break of day. The banker was with them, and so was Ben Omar and his clerk, a veritable caravan of 6 persons, knowing now where this irresistible appetite for millions was taking them. There was no need now to make any mystery of the matter with Ben Omar, and consequently, Saouk was not unaware that Island Number 2 was in the Gulf of Guinea. "A long way this time," said Jules to Ben Omar, "and if you are afraid of the fatigues of the voyage, you are quite at liberty to give it up. And really it is a good many hundreds of miles by sea, from Algiers to Luango." Ben Omar, however, had no hesitation about going, for Saouk would have permitted none. And besides, there was the magnificent commission glittering before his eyes. Thus on the 24th of April, Antifer, dragging with him Tregamain and Jules, and Saouk dragging with him Ben Omar, and Zimbuco dragging himself, occupied their places in the coach or diligence which runs between Tunis and Beaune. Perhaps they might not exchange a word, but at least they would travel together. Let it not be forgotten that the evening before Jules had written another letter to Enogat. In a few days the girl and her mother would know for what part of the globe Antifer was bound in search of his famous legacy, now reduced by 50%. It was not too much to reckon that this second voyage would last a month, that Enogat would see her lover again in the middle of May. How Enogat would despair when she received this letter! If she could only have hoped that at Jules' return all the difficulties would be smoothed over, and her wedding take place without delay. But what could she expect with such an uncle? Tregamain, then, was destined to cross the line. He, the bargeman of the Rance, was to sail in the southern hemisphere. What would you have? Life is made up of such unlikely things that the excellent man would be astonished at nothing, not even at being at the indicated spot and digging out of Island Number 2 the 3 famous barrels of Camel Lake Pasha. These considerations did not, however, hinder him from casting a look of curiosity over the country through which the diligence was passing, which over slightly resembled the plains of Brittany, even those that are hilly. But probably he was the only traveler of the 6 who thought of retaining some remembrance of the appearance of the country. The vehicle was not comfortable, and did not travel fast. From one stage to another, the 3 horses trot along uphill and downhill, with many a sudden turn amid the alpine scenery, especially in this wonderful Medjerda valley, dashing over torrents, which had no bridges, with the water often up to the axle trees. The weather was beautiful, the sky of a deep blue, or rather a ripe blue, as if browned slightly by the intense heat of the sun. The Bardo, the base palace, which they saw on the left shore, so brilliantly white that would have been prudent to look at only through smoked glasses. So it was with the other palaces, embowered in thick fig trees and pear trees, like weeping willows, with their branches drooping to the ground. Here and there were groups of tents of striped cloth, under which appeared the heads of Arab women of serious countenance, and the brown faces of children, no less grave than their mothers. Afar in the fields, on the slopes, amid the rocky steeps, were herds of sheep, and goats as black as crows. Now and then birds would fly around the diligence, and then the whip would crack in the air. Among these birds, parrots were numerous, and distinguishable by their vivid colors. They were in thousands, and if nature had taught them to sing, man had not yet taught them to talk. And so the diligence traveled. The horses were changed frequently. Tregamain and Jules never omitted to get out and stretch their legs. Zimbuco alighted occasionally, but never spoke to his companions. "There is a man," said the bargeman, "who seems as greedy of the Pasha's millions as our friend Antifer." "Quite so, Tregamain, and the 2 legatees are worthy of each other." Whenever he alighted, Saouk tried to overhear what was being said. Ben Omar remained quietly in his corner, engrossed in the thought that he would soon have to go to the sea again, and after the choppy waves of the Mediterranean, he would have to brave the long rollers of the Atlantic. Antifer also never moved. He sat with his thoughts concentrated on this Island Number 2, this rock lost amid the burning African waters. Before sunset, there appeared a group of mosques, marabouts, white domes, slender minarets. This was Taberka, encircled by a frame of verdure, in which remains intact its aspect as a Tunisian town. The diligence stopped here for some hours. The travelers alighted at a hotel, or rather an inn, where they were served with a not particularly appetizing repast. As to visiting the town, it was not to be thought of. Of the 6, there was only the bargeman, and perhaps Jules if he asked him, who would have had such an idea. Besides, Captain Antifer ordered them, once and for all, not to go far away, for fear of occasioning delay, and he took care to do as they were told. At 9 o'clock the journey was resumed, the night fine and starlight, but it was not without danger that vehicles venture across the deserted districts between sunset and sunrise. For there are dangers from the bad state of the roads, dangers from robbers, Cremiers and others, dangers from attack by wild beasts. Occasionally, from amid the tranquil gloom along the edge of the thick woods skirted by the diligence, could be heard the roaring of lions and the growling of leopards. At this the horses shied, and it took all the driver's skill to master them. The cries of the hyenas were heard unheeded. The zenith grew paler towards 4 o'clock in the morning, and the diffused light grew strong enough for the details of the landscape to be gradually visible. But the horizon was not extensive, only the gray hills and long undulations thrown on the ground like an Arab cloak. The valley of the Majerda lay curving at their feet, with its yellow river, sometimes a smooth stream, sometimes a troubled torrent, flowing among the oleanders and flowering eucalyptus. The country is varied and mountainous in this part of the Regency, bordering on Crumeria. If the bargeman had traveled in the Tyrol, he might have thought himself among the wilder portions of the Alps, if it had not been for the lesser heights of the hills. But he was not in the Tyrol, nor in Europe, from which he was daily going further. And then the corners of his mouth would rise, which rendered his physiognomy more pensive, and his thick eyebrows would fall, which made him look more uneasy. Now and then he and Jules would look at each other, and these looks were quite a silent conversation. In the morning, Antifer asked his nephew, "Where shall we get to before night?" "Gardemeo." "And when shall we be at Beaune?" "Tomorrow evening." The gloomy Antifer resumed his habitual silence, or rather his thoughts were lost in that uninterrupted dream which led him from the Gulf of Oman to the Gulf of Guinea, and rested on the only point of the terrestrial spheroid which could interest him. And then he thought to himself that other eyes besides his own were fixed on this point, those of the banker Zambuco. In truth, these two beings, of races so different, of habits so opposite, who ought never to have met in this world, seemed to have become of one mind, as if they had been linked together like galley slaves with the same chain. Only the chain was of gold. The forest of fig trees became thicker and thicker. Now and then Arab villages emerged from the glaucous greenery, with which the castor oil trees tint their flowers and leaves. Sometimes there appeared a drèche or two on the sloping sides of the mountains. Here tents arose, and sheep fed on the banks of a torrent. Then a station for changing horses would appear, generally some miserable stable where men and beasts lived together promiscuously. In the evening they reached Gardemeo, or rather the wooden cabin surrounded by a few others, which 20 years afterwards was to form one of the stations of the railway from Beaune to Tunis. After a halt of 2 hours, too long for the rudimentary dinner furnished by the inn, the diligence resumed its journey along the windings of the valley, sometimes skirting the Majerda, sometimes crossing the brooks, of which the waters often rose over the travelers' feet as they sat in the coach, toiling up hills so steep that the horses could hardly draw the load, dashing down slopes with a rapidity that the brake could hardly check. The country was magnificent, particularly in the environs of Motars, but no one could see anything in the very dark, misty night, and everyone was being overcome by the longing for sleep after 43 hours of such jolting. The dawn had appeared when Antifer and his companions arrived at Sucaris, at the end of a tiresome winding on the flank of a hill, which united the town to the road along the valley. A comfortable hotel welcomed the weary travelers. This time, the 3 hours they rested did not appear too long, and certainly would have appeared too short if they wanted to visit the picturesque town. Antifer and Zambuco, of course, protested against the time lost at this halting place, but the coach was not due to start until 6 o'clock in the morning. Calm yourself, said Tregamain to his irritable companion. We shall be at Beaune in time to catch the train tomorrow morning. And why not, with a little more haste, catch it tonight, retorted Antifer. There is not one, said Jules. Suppose there is not. Is that any reason for us remaining in this hole? Here, my friend, said the bargeman, here is a pebble I picked up for you. Yours ought to be nearly worn out by this time. And Tregamain handed him a charming specimen of Majorca gravel, the size of a green pea, which was soon being ground between the Malouin's teeth. The bargeman then asked him to accompany them only to the principal square. He refused point blank, and drawing the atlas out of his bag, he opened it at the map of Africa, and plunged into the waters of the Gulf of Guinea at the risk of drowning his reason. Tregamain and Jules went for a stroll on the Place de Gast, a vast quadrilateral planted with a few trees, bordered with houses of very oriental aspect, with cafes, already open at that early hour, which were crowded with natives. At the first rays of the sun, the mists dispersed, and a fine day, warm and bright, announced itself. As he walked, the bargeman was all eyes and ears. He tried to hear all that was going on, although he understood nothing. He strove to see what was happening in the interiors of the cafes and in the shops, although he bought nothing and drank nothing. As wayward fortune had sent him on this unlooked-for voyage, the least he could do was to bring away a few lasting impressions. And thus he spoke. No, Jules, we cannot keep on traveling as we are doing. We stop nowhere. 3 hours at Sucaris, 1 night in Beaune, 2 days on the railway, with short stoppages at the stations. What have I seen of Tunis? What shall I see of Algeria? I admit it. It is only common sense. But say that to my uncle, and see what he'll say to you. This is not a pleasure journey, but a business one, and who knows how it will end? In a hoax, I think. Yes, continued Jules. Why should not island number 2 contain a document referring us to island number 3? And so on to island number 4 and island 5 and all the islands in the sea, said Tregamain, nodding his big head. And you will follow my uncle. I? Yes, you. You cannot refuse him anything. That is true. The poor man troubles me much, and I am afraid his head... Well, Tregamain, as far as I'm concerned, I draw the line at island number 2. Does Enegate want to marry a prince? Do I want to marry a princess? Certainly not. Besides, now we have to share the treasure with this crocodile of a Zambuco. It is only a question of a duke for her, and a duchess for you. Do not laugh, Tregamain. I was wrong, my boy. It is no laughing matter. And if we have to prolong this search... Prolong? Asked Jules. No. We go to the Gulf of Luango, but beyond, never. I shall know how to make my uncle return to St. Malo. And if he refuses? If he refuse, I will leave him there and then. I will return to Enogate, and, as she will be of age in a few months, I shall marry her in spite of wind and tide. Do not be obstinate, my dear boy, and have patience. All will come right, I hope. It will end with your marrying my little Enegate, and I will dance at your wedding. But do not let us miss the diligence. Let us return to the hotel. If it is not asking too much, I'd rather reach Beaune before night, so as to see a little of the town. As to Constantine, Philippeville, and all the other queer places, what shall we see of them? If it is not possible, I shall have to be contented with Algiers, where we shall stay a few days, I suppose. He's not likely to find a vessel ready to start immediately for the west coast of Africa, and he'll have to wait for one. We will wait, replied the bargeman, smiling at the thought of visiting the marvels of the Algerian capital. You know Algiers, Jules? Yes, Tregamain. I have heard sailors say that it is very fine. The town in the semicircle, its wharves, squares, arsenal, garden, its Mustafa, its Casbah particularly. Very fine, Tregamain, interrupted Jules, but I know something finer. There is St. Malo, and the house in the Rue des Hautes Salles, and the little room on the first floor, and the little girl who lives therein, eh? I am of your opinion, my boy, but as we have to pass Algiers, let me hope that I may visit Algiers. And abandoning himself to this hope, the bargeman, followed by his young friend, turned towards the hotel. It was time. The horses were being put to. Captain Antifer was striding to and fro, growling at all late-comers, although they were not late. Treguier bowed his head beneath the stormy look his friend launched at him. In a few minutes, they were all seated, and the diligence was descending the rugged slopes of Sucaris. It was really a pity that the bargeman was not allowed to explore this Tunisian territory. Nothing could be more picturesque. Hills which are almost mountains, wooded ravines, which forced the future railway to make many a roundabout route across the opulent verdure, large rocks rising from the ground, here and there douars swarming with natives and with big fires round them at night, as a defense against wild beasts. Treguier would relate what the driver had told him, for he talked with him whenever he had an opportunity. In a year, 40 lions at least are killed among the brushwood, and the leopards killed amount to several hundreds, to say nothing of the crowds of howling jackals. Antifer cared nothing for Tunisian leopards and lions. If there had been 1,000,000 of them on island number 2, he would not retreat an inch from his purpose. But the banker on one side, and the notary on the other, listened to Treguier's tales with interest. Zambuco would often take a sly glance out of the window, and Ben Omar would lean back in his corner and start and turn pale whenever a growl was heard from the thicket along the road. "I have heard," said Treguier, "that the diligence has been attacked before now, and firearms had to be used to drive the beasts off. Last night even, the coach had to be burnt to drive off a lot of leopards by the glare of the flames." "And the travelers?" asked Ben Omar. "The travelers had to journey on foot to one of the places where they change horses." "On foot!" exclaimed the notary in a trembling voice. "I could never." "Well, you could have remained behind, Mr. Omar. We should not have waited for you, you may be sure." It could be guessed that this observation came from Captain Antifer. He did not again join in the conversation, and Ben Omar had to recognize that he was not born to be a traveler, either on land or sea. The day went by without the wild beasts manifesting their presence, except by distant growls. But to his great disgust, Treguier had to make up his mind that it would be night before the diligence reached Beaune. It was 7 o'clock in the evening when they passed Hippo, a locality that is famous as being linked with the imperishable name of St. Augustine, and curious on account of its deep reservoir, where the old Arabs indulged in their incantations and sorceries. 20 years later, they would have seen the founding of the basilica and the hospital, which have risen from the ground under the powerful hand of Cardinal de la Vigiere. As they entered Beaune, a deep darkness enveloped its promenade along the shore, its harbor terminating the sandy point to the westward, the clumps of trees which shade the quay, the modern city with its large square, its Kasbah, which might have given the bargeman a foretaste of the Kasbah of Algiers. The travelers chose a hotel in the chief square, had their supper, and went to bed at 10 o'clock, ready for the journey next morning. And that night, thoroughly tired out by 60 hours in the diligence, they all slept, even the terrible Antifer. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 22. Captain Antifer thought he would find a railway between Beaune and Algiers, but he had arrived 20 years too soon. The reply he received early next morning when he asked the hotel keeper proved a puzzler for him. "What?" he said with a start. "Is there no railway from Beaune to Algiers?" "No, sir," said the facetious hotel keeper, "but there will be one in a few years' time if you want to wait." Doubtless Ben Omar would have asked nothing better, for it would probably become necessary to go by sea to avoid delay. But Antifer had no intention of waiting. "Is there no boat announcing the sail?" he asked in an imperious voice. "Yes, this morning." "Let us go on board." And at 6 o'clock, Antifer left Beaune on a steamer with 2 companions of his choice, and the 3 necessity had imposed on him. We need not dwell on the incidents of this short voyage of a few hundred miles. Treguier would have preferred to have performed this navigation in a carriage, so as to have been able to see these territories which the remarkable railway was to traverse a few years later. But he reckoned on making up for his disappointment at Algiers. If Antifer imagined that as soon as he arrived he would find a vessel starting for the west coast of Africa, he would be deceived, and would have to exercise a little patience. Meanwhile, what delightful walks Treguier would have in the environs. Perhaps even to Blida, or to the Monkey Brook. That the bargeman would gain nothing by the discovery of the treasure might be true, but at least he would gather a rich collection of memories of the journey to the Algerian capital. It was 8 o'clock in the evening when the steamer, which made a quick passage, dropped anchor in the harbor of Algiers. The night in these latitudes was then dark, even in the last week of March, although the sky was glittering with stars. The confused mass of the town rose gloomily toward the north, rounded by the Kasbah. This Kasbah so greatly desired. All that Tregomain could see in leaving the landing place was that he had to climb a lot of steps, abutting on the quay, supported by monumental arcades, and that he had to go along this quay, leaving to the left a square brilliant with lights, in which he would not have been displeased to stop. Then a block of high houses, comprising the Hotel de l'Europe, in which Captain Antifer and his party were hospitably received. They were shown to their rooms, Tregomain's adjoining Jules. They had their luggage brought up, and they went down to dine. That occupied them until 9 o'clock, and as there was plenty of time to wait for the departure of the steamer, the best thing for them to do was to go to bed and rest, so as to be in fit condition next morning to begin a series of walks through the town. But before taking the rest justified by this long journey, Jules wrote to Annegate. He did this as soon as he regained his room. The letter would go in the morning, and in 3 days it would reach her. There was nothing very interesting in the letter except that Jules was almost mad at the delay, and that he loved her with all his heart, in which there was nothing new. But while Ben Omar and Saouk went to their room, and Tregomain and Jules went to theirs, Antifer and Zambuco, the two brothers-in-law, as it is surely permissible to describe them after the signing and sealing of their contract, disappeared from the hotel after dinner without assigning any reason. This rather surprised the bargeman and the young captain, and perhaps made Saouk and Ben Omar uneasy, but it was not likely that Antifer would have answered any questions on the subject. Where did the legatees go? To stroll along the picturesque quarters of Algiers? Probably not. It was noticed that during the latter part of the journey, Antifer had occasionally conversed in a low tone with the banker, and that Zambuco had appeared to approve of his companion's suggestions. What they had been talking about? Was this going out late part of a prearranged plan? What plan? What strange combinations were possible with two men of this kind? After shaking hands with Jules, the bargeman went into his room. Before undressing, he opened the window wide to breathe a little of this delightful Algerian air. In the pale starlight he looked over the wide expanse, all the roadstead up to Cape Matafou, over which glittered the lights of the vessels, many of them at anchor, many of them coming in with the night breeze, while the coast was aglow with the torches used by the fishermen. Closer in were the steamers getting under way, their large funnels belching forth showers of sparks. Beyond Cape Matafou was the open sea, bounded by a horizon on which the splendid constellations were rising like displays of fireworks. The next day would be magnificent, if it fulfilled the promises of the night. The sun would rise radiantly and outshine the last stars of the morning. How pleasant, thought Tregomain, will it be to visit this noble town of Algiers, to have a few days' rest after this diabolical rush from Muscat, and before being hoaxed again at island number 2. I have heard of Moisey's restaurant at Point Bascade. Why should we not go tomorrow and have a good dinner at this Moisey's? At this moment came a loud knock at the door, just as 10 o'clock was about to strike. "Is that you, Jules?" asked Tregomain. "No, it is Antifer." "I will open the door, my friend." "Useless. Dress and pack up." "My portmanteau?" "We start in 40 minutes." "In 40 minutes?" "And mind you are not late, for the steamers don't wait as a rule. I'm going to tell Jules." Overwhelmed with surprise, the bargeman thought he must be dreaming. No, he heard the knock on Jules' door, and Antifer's voice telling him to get up. Then he heard the departing footsteps descending the stairs. Jules, who was writing, added a line to his letter telling Annegate that they were all going to leave Algiers that very evening. That, then, was why Zambuco and Antifer had gone out. It was to inquire if any ship was sailing for the coast of Africa. By unhoped-for good fortune, they had found the said steamer preparing to start. They had secured the berths, and then, without troubling himself about ceremony, Antifer had returned to tell Tregomain and Jules, while the banker warned Ben Omar and Nazim. The bargeman was inexpressibly disappointed as he packed up, but nothing was to be said. The chief had spoken. He must obey. Almost immediately Jules came into the room. "You are not going to stop?" he said. "No, my boy, although I ought to do so for your uncle's sake." And I who promised myself at least 2 days in Algiers, and the harbor, and the gardens, and the Casbah. But what could you expect, Tregamain? It is most unfortunate that my uncle has found his ship ready for sea. Yes, but I shall strike before it is over, said the bargeman with a gesture of anger. No, Tregamain, you will never strike. If you were to attempt such a thing, my uncle would only have to look at you in a certain way, and you would have to give in. You are right, Jewel, replied Tregamain, lowering his head. I would obey. You know me well. It is a nuisance all the same, and this fine dinner I was thinking of giving you at Moisey's at Point Bascade. Vain regrets. The poor man heaved a sigh and completed his preparations. 10 minutes afterwards, Jewel and he had found Antifer, Zambuco, and the others in the vestibule of the hotel. If they had been welcomed on their arrival, they were not allowed to depart so cheerfully, and had to pay for their rooms as if they had occupied them for a day. Joe put his letter in the box, and then they all descended the stairs leading to the harbor, while Tregamain took a last look at Government Square. Half a cable's length away, a steamer was moored with her steam up. Black smoke rose from her funnel to the sky. Her whistle was already announcing that she would soon be off. A boat at the quay steps was waiting to bring the passengers on board. Antifer and his companions took their places in her. In a few strokes of the oars, they were alongside. Before even Tregamain could make out where he was conducted to the cabin he was to share with Jewel. Antifer and Zambuco occupied a second, the notary and Saouk a third. The steamer was the Catalan, belonging to a Marseille company, employed in the regular service of the west coast of Africa to St. Louis and Dakar. She called in at intermediate ports when necessary to receive or discharge passengers or goods. A quarter of an hour after Antifer had arrived, a final scream of the whistle rent the air. Then her hawsers were slackened off, and the Catalan began to tremble. Her screw spun round violently, beating up a streak of foam on the surface of the sea, and she glided round the vessels at anchor, took the channel between the arsenal and the jetty, and headed to the westward. A vague mass of white houses greeted the bargeman's eyes. This was the Casbah, of which he could only make out the general outline. A cape jutted out from the coast. This was Point Bascade, the point on which was the restaurant of Moisey, who made those succulent bouillabaisses. And that was all Tregamain brought away with him to remind him of his stay in Algiers. We need hardly mention that as soon as the harbor was left, Ben Omar, extended on the couch in his cabin, began again to taste the delights of seasickness. And when he thought of his voyage to the Gulf of Guinea, he also thought of his return. Fortunately, that would be his last passage. On this island number 2, he was certain of getting his promised commission. But if some of the others had also been ill, it would have been more soothing to him, and not one of them felt the slightest nausea. He was the only one to suffer. He did not even have the very natural consolation of seeing one of his kind share his sufferings. The passengers on the Catalan were mostly sailors returning to the ports of the coast, a few Senegalese, and a certain number of soldiers of the marine infantry, accustomed to the eventualities of navigation. They were all bound for Dakar, where the steamer was to land her cargo. She was not going to stop anywhere on the road, and Antifer could but congratulate himself on having precipitated himself on board. It is true when we got to Dakar, he would not be at the end of his journey, and to this Zambuco called his attention. Agreed, he said, but I never expected to find a steamer going from Algiers to Luango, and when we are at Dakar, we will see about matters. In fact, it would have been difficult to have done otherwise. The difficulty would be in the last part of the voyage, and therein was a subject for serious anxiety on the part of the expectant brothers-in-law. During the night, the Catalan kept along at some 2 or 3 miles from the coast. The lights of Ténèz were observed, and the somber mass of Cape Blanc could just be distinguished. In the morning, the heights of Oran were sighted, and an hour afterwards the steamer doubled the promontory, on the other side of which is the roadstead of Mers el Kabir. Further on, the coast of Morocco developed on the port side, with its distant profile of mountains dominating the Rif country, where game is so plentiful. On the horizon appeared Tetuan, quite striking under the solar rays. Then, a few miles to the west, Ceuta planted on its rock, between 2 creeks, like a fort commanding one of the swing doors of the Mediterranean, the key to the other swing doors being kept by Great Britain. And beyond, in the offing through the straits, appeared the immense Atlantic. The wooded slopes of the coast of Morocco could be plainly made out. Tangiers was past hidden in the curve of its gulf, its villas amid the green trees, many marabouts here and gleaming white in the sun. The sea was dotted with numerous sailing vessels waiting for the wind to take them through the straits of Gibraltar. The Catalan had no delays to fear. Neither the breeze nor the current, recognizable by a peculiar rippling in the vicinity of the straits, could contend against her powerful screw, and towards 9 o'clock in the evening she was beating with its triple blade the wide Atlantic. The bargeman and Jewel were talking on the poop before retiring for a few hours' rest. Naturally, the same thought occurred to them as the Catalan, steering southwest, doubled the extreme point of Africa, a thought of regret. "Yes, my boy," said Tregomain, "it would have been preferable if, on coming out of the straits, we had gone starboard instead of port. At least we should not have turned our heels on France." "And to go whither?" "To the devil, I am afraid. But you must endure evil with patience, Jewel. You can return from everywhere, even from the devil. In a few days we shall be at Dakar, and from Dakar to the Gulf of Guinea." "Who knows if we shall find any means of transport from Dakar? There is no regular service beyond. We may be kept there for weeks, and if my uncle imagines— he does imagine, never doubt it— that it will be easy for him to reach island number 2, he is mistaken. Do you know what I think, Tregomain?" "No, my boy, but if you'd like to tell me— well, I think that my grandfather, Thomas Antifer, ought to have left this confounded Camel Lake on the rocks of Jaffa." "But, Jewel, the poor man—" "If he had left him there, this Egyptian could not have left his millions to his rescuer. If he had not left his millions, my uncle could not have run after them, and Enogate would be my wife." "That is all very true, but if you had been there, Jewel, you would have saved the life of this unfortunate Pasha as your grandfather did. What is that?" he added to turn the conversation. "What is that light?" showing a bright light on the port bow. "That is the lighthouse of Cape Spartel," replied Jewel. In fact, it was a lighthouse placed at the western extremity of the African coast and maintained at the expense of the state of Europe, the most advanced of those that projected their rays over the surface of the African seas. The voyage of the Catalan need not be related in detail. The steamer was favored. She picked up a land breeze in these parts, and can keep at a short distance from the coast. The sea was agitated merely by the long, rolling swell coming in from the westward, and it required the most susceptible of Omars to be ill in such weather. The shore remained in view. The heights of Mekinez, of Magador, Mount Thachat, which dominates this region from a height of about 3,000 feet, Taroudant, and Cape Juby, where the frontier of Morocco ends. Tregomain did not have the satisfaction of seeing the Canary Isles, as the Catalan passed some 50 miles to the eastward of Fuerteventura, the nearest of the group, but he was able to salute Cape Bojador before crossing the Tropic of Cancer. Cape Blanco was passed in the afternoon on the 2nd of May. Next morning they were off Portendijk, and then the country of the Senegal lay spread before the travelers' eyes. As all the passengers were bound to Dakar, the Catalan had no occasion to put in at St. Louis, which is the capital of this French colony. Dakar seems to be of more maritime importance than St. Louis, and Antifer would probably find it easier there to obtain some means of transport to the Loango. At length, on the 5th, about 4 in the morning, the Catalan doubled the famous Cape Verde, situated in the same latitude as the islands of this name. She rounded the triangular peninsula, which hangs like a flag on the edge of the African continent, and the port of Dakar appeared on the lower angle of the peninsula, after a voyage of 800 leagues from Algiers. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 23. Never had Tregomain imagined the day would come when he'd be walking with Jewel on the quays of Dakar, the ancient capital of the Gorian Republic. And yet that is what he did on this particular day, visiting the port, protected by its double jetty of granite rocks, while Antifer and Zambuco, as inseparable as Ben Omar and Saouk, went up to the French agency. A day is amply sufficient for seeing the town. There's nothing very interesting about it, a rather good public garden, a citadel affording quarters for the garrison, and Bel Air Point, on which is an establishment to which are sent those suffering from yellow fever. If our travelers were to remain many days in this country, which has Gori for its capital and Dakar for its chief town, the lapse of time would appear interminable. But it is as well to keep a good heart against ill fortune, as Tregamain and Jules said to one another. And meanwhile they strolled along the wharves and up and down the sunny streets, which are kept in good order by convicts, under the supervision of a few warders. The only things that interested them were the ships, these bits of herself which France sent from Bordeaux to Rio de Janeiro. These steamers of the Messageries Imperiales, as the line was called in 1862. Dakar was not then the important station it has become today. It possessed some 9,000 inhabitants, with a tendency to increase its population, owing to the important works in progress for the improvement of the port. If the bargeman had never made acquaintance with the Bambaras Negroes, he had now an easy opportunity of doing so, for these natives swarmed in Dakar. Thanks to their dry, nervous temperament, their thick skulls, their woolly hair, they were able to support with impunity the fierceness of the Senegalian sun. Tregamain had hung his square handkerchief behind his head as the best substitute he can find for a sunshade. "Good gracious, it is hot," he exclaimed. "I really was not made to live in the tropics." "This is nothing, Tregamain," replied Jules. "When we are in the Gulf of Guinea, a few degrees below the equator—" "I shall melt, for a certainty," replied the bargeman, "and I shall take nothing back to my country but skin and bones. And," said he with the sweetest of smiles, as he mopped his face, "it will be difficult to take home less." "You are much thinner than you were." "Think so? Bah! I have a margin yet before I am reduced to a skeleton. In my opinion, it is better to be thin in countries where the people feed on human flesh. Are there any cannibals on the Guinea coast?" "Not many. At least I hope not." "Well, my boy, do not tempt the natives by being too fat. Who knows if after island number 2, we have to be off to island number 3, in countries where people feed on each other." "As in the islands of the Pacific?" "Yes. There the inhabitants are anthropophagous." He meant to say philanthropophagous, if he had been capable of inventing the word, for in these countries it is out of pure gormandizing that the natives eat their kind. But to think that Captain Antifer would be so obstinate as to let this madness for the millions drive him to such distant spots was not admissible. Certainly his nephew and his friend would never follow him there, and would prevent him from entering on such a campaign, even if it meant having to shut him up in a lunatic asylum. When Tregamain and Jules returned to the hotel, they found Antifer and the banker. The French agent had received them cordially, but when they asked for a vessel bound for Luango port, his answer was not encouraging. The steamers engaged in the trade are very irregular, and under any circumstances do not call at Dakar more than once a month. There was a weekly service between Sierra Leone and Grand Bassam, but from there to Luango was a long way further. The first steamer was not due at Dakar for a week. How unfortunate! A whole week for him to spend in his town chafing at his bit. And would have to be of well-tempered steel, this bit, to resist the teeth of Captain Antifer, who was now chewing down a pebble a day. It is true that there is no want of pebbles on the African beach, so that Antifer would have no difficulty in supplying his wants. We cannot avoid remarking that the week at Dakar was long, very long. The walks about the harbor, the excursions to the brook at the east of the town, had very soon exhausted their charms. Such patience was required as only an easy philosophy could give, but with the exception of Tregamain, who was remarkably gifted in this respect, Antifer and his companions were neither patient nor philosophical. If they blessed Kamalik Pasha for having chosen them for his heirs, they cursed him for the caprice by which he had buried the heritage so far away. It was really too much to send them to the Gulf of Oman, and now they had to go to the Gulf of Guinea. Why could not the Egyptian have found a quiet little island in the European seas? Was there not one in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, in the North Sea, with every convenience for the stowage of 3 casks? Really, the Pasha had indulged in quite a plethora of precautions. But so it was, and if you like to abandon this treasure quest, abandon it? See what a reception you would have had from Antifer and Zambuco, and even the notary held in the grip of the violent Sauk. The bonds which attached these companions to each other were being visibly relaxed. These were 3 distinct groups: Antifer and Zambuco, Omar and Sauk, Jules and Tregamain. They lived apart, meeting each other only at mealtimes, avoiding each other during their walks. They sorted themselves out into twos, and seemed as though they would never combine in the final sextet, which could only result in abominable cacophony. As regards the Jules and Tregamain group, we know the usual subject of the conversation: the infinite prolongation of the voyage, the gradual widening of the separation between the lovers, the fear that so many researches and fatigues could only end in a hoax. the state of Antifer's sanity. All of them causes of regret for the bargeman and Jewel, but made up their minds not to withstand him, and to follow him to the end. As regards the Antifer and Zambuco group, what a curious study these two future brothers-in-law would have made for a moralist. One, up to then of simple tastes, living a quiet life in a quiet town, with the philosophy natural to a retired sailor, now a prey to the lust for gold, his mind deranged by this mirage of millions gleaming under his eyes. The other, already so rich, but having no other care than to heap riches on riches, exposing himself to so many fatigues, to so many dangers even, in the endeavor to increase the heap. "A week to get rusty at the bottom of this hole," said Captain Antifer, "and who knows if this wretched steamer will not be late." "And then," said the banker, "our ill fortune makes us land at Loango, and thence go up 50 leagues to Mayumba Bay." "It is uneasy about the end of this road," said the irascible Antifer. "Enough to make you uneasy," observed the banker. "It is no good anchoring till we reach the roadsteads. Let's get to Loango, and then we will see. We might persuade the captain of the steamer to put in at Mayumba. It would not take him far out of his way." "I do not suppose he would consent, and he is not likely to be allowed to do so." "If we were to offer him an indemnity, he might," suggested the banker. "We will see, Zambuco, but you are always thinking of what never occurs to me. The essential is to arrive at Loango, and from there we can get to Mayumba. At least we have legs, and if necessary, and there is no other way of leaving Dakar, I should not hesitate at going round by the coast." "On foot?" "Yes, on foot." He spoke quite airily, but the dangers, the obstacles, the impossibilities of such a journey! He might think himself lucky to be able to find a steamer, and thus avoid the perils of the journey. Not one of those who accompanied him on such an expedition would have returned, and Talisman Zambuco would have waited in vain at home in Malta for the return of her too audacious husband that was to be. And so they had to resign themselves to this steamboat, which could not arrive for a week. But how long seemed the hours spent at Dakar! Quite different was the conversation of Saouk and Ben Omar. Not that the son of Murad was less impatient to reach the island and carry off the treasure of Kamalik Pasha. His thoughts were concentrated on the way in which he would best rob the legatees. He intended to carry this out on the return from Sohar to Muscat. Now he would attempt it on the return from Mayumba to Luongo. Certainly his chances had improved. Among the natives and interlopers, he ought to find a few fellows capable of anything, even the shedding of blood, if necessary, who would manage this matter for him. And the prospect of this terrified the pusillanimous Ben Omar, less from delicacy of feeling than from fear at being mixed up in such an affair. He made a few timid suggestions. He remarked that Captain Antifer and his companions were men who would sell their lives dearly. He insisted on the point that no matter how much Saouk paid them, the scoundrels he employed will talk about it sooner or later, that the truth is always found out at last regarding the massacre of explorers in any part of Africa. His arguments were directed, in fact, not against the criminality of the attempt, but arose from fear of being found out, the only reason which could stop such a man as Saouk. But they had no effect on him. Giving the notary one of these looks which chilled the very marrow in his bones, he said, "I only know of one imbecile who is capable of betraying me." "And who is that?" "You, Ben Omar." "Me?" "Yes, and take care, for I know how to make people hold their tongues." Ben Omar, trembling in all his limbs, bowed his head. One corpse more or less on the road from Mayumba to Loango would not embarrass Saouk, as he well knew. The expected steamer dropped anchor at Dakar in the morning of the 12th of May. This was the Sintra, a Portuguese vessel bound with passengers and goods to San Paulo de Luanda, the important Lusitania colony of tropical Africa. She regularly stopped at Loango, and that she started early next morning, Antifer's companions at once booked their berths. As their speed was only from 9 to 10 knots, the voyage would last a week, during which Ben Omar would suffer as usual. Having dropped a few passengers at Dakar, the Sintra started next morning in fine weather, with the breeze blowing off the land. Antifer and the banker heaved an immense sigh of satisfaction, as if their lungs had not been working for a week. This was the last stage before setting foot on island number 2, and putting their hand on the treasure it was guarding so carefully. The attraction the island exercised on them seemed to become more powerful as they approached it, conformably to natural laws, increasing inversely as the square of the distance. And at every turn of the screw of the Sintra, the distance decreased. As for Jules, it increased. He went farther and farther away from France, from Brittany, where Enogate sat in sorrow. He had written to her from Dakar as soon as he arrived, and the poor girl would soon learn that her lover was farther away from her than ever, and could fix no date as to a probable return. So he tried to find out what passengers were to be landed at Luongo. Among these adventurers, with consciences untroubled by scruples or remorse, who were in search of fortune in these distant lands, were there any who knew the country and were likely to become his accomplices? His Excellency could not find any. He would have to choose his rascals when he reached Luongo. Unfortunately, he could not speak Portuguese, neither could Ben Omar. This was embarrassing, as he had to treat of delicate matters and express himself quite clearly. Antifer, Zambuco, Tregamain, and Jules were reduced to talking among themselves, for no one on board spoke French. There was one whose surprise was equal to his satisfaction. Ben Omar, to wit. To say he felt no discomfort during his voyage on the Sintra would be untrue, but at the same time, the intense suffering he had frequently experienced was now spared him. The Sintra kept within 2 or 3 miles of the coast. The sea was calm, and she felt very little of the swell on the open sea. This continued after she had doubled Cape Palmas, the extreme point of the Gulf of Guinea. As often happens, the breeze followed the line of the coast, and the Gulf was as smooth as the ocean. But the Sintra had to lose sight of the land when her course was laid for Luongo. The travelers saw nothing of Ashanti-land, nor of Dahomey, nor even the summit of Mount Cameroon, which rises for some 12,000 feet beyond Fernando Po on the confines of Upper Guinea. In the afternoon of the 19th of May, Tregamain became somewhat excited. Jules told him he was about to cross the equator. For the first time, for the last no doubt, the bargeman was about to enter the southern hemisphere. What an adventure for him, the mariner of the Rance! And it was without regret, following the example of the other passengers, he gave the crew of the Sintra his piastre in recognition of the honor of crossing the line. At sunrise the next morning, the Sintra was in the latitude of Mayumba, but about 100 miles to the west of it. If the captain of the steamer had agreed to put in at a port which belongs to the state of Luongo, what fatigues, what dangers perhaps, would have been spared Captain Antifer. Such a call would have saved him an extreme difficult journey along the coast. Urged by his uncle, Jules tried to argue the matter with the captain of the Sintra. The Portuguese knew a few words of English, as what sailor does not? And Jules, as we know, spoke this language fluently. He introduced the proposal to stop at Mayumba. It would take the steamer only 2 days out of her way. The expenses would be paid for the delay, the coal, the provisions, the indemnity to the owners of the Sintra, etc. Did the captain understand Jules' proposal? Certainly, when it was explained on the chart of the Gulf of Guinea. Sailors soon understand each other in such matters. Nothing was easier than to steer eastwards so as to land this half-dozen passengers at Mayumba, provided the passengers were willing to pay. But the captain refused. He was freighted for Luongo. He would go to Luongo. From Luongo, he was bound to San Paul de Luanda. And to San Paul de Luanda, he would go, and nowhere else, even if they bought the ship for her weight in gold. Such were the expressions he used, which Jules clearly understood, and translated to his uncle. Terrible was Antifer's anger, and fearful the broadside of oaths he let fly at the captain. If it had not been for the intervention of Tregamain and Jules, Antifer, in a state of mutiny, would have been sent as a prisoner to the hold for the rest of the voyage. 2 days afterwards, in the evening of the 21st of May, the Sintra stopped before the long sandbank, which defends the coast of Luongo, and landed with her launch the passengers in question. A few hours afterwards, she was off again on her way to San Paul, the capital of the Portuguese colony. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 24. Next day, beneath the baobab tree, which sheltered them from the fiery rays of the sun, 2 men were in conversation. As they had come up the principal street of Luongo, where they met by the greatest chance, they had recognized each other with many gestures of surprise. One had said, "You, here?" "Yes, here," the other had replied, and a sign from the first, who was Sauk. The second, a Portuguese man, Barroso, had followed him out of the town. Although Sauk did not speak the language of Barroso, Barroso spoke the language of his excellency, for he had lived for some time in Egypt. Two old acquaintances these. Barroso was one of the band of adventurers under Saouk, when he was engaged in every kind of depredation, without being troubled by the agents of the viceroy, thanks to the influence of Moran, his father, the cousin of Kamlik Pasha. When the band had been broken up, after 2 or 3 outrages too bad to be overlooked, Barroso had disappeared. Returning to Portugal, where there was no scope for his particular abilities, he had left Lisbon to work in a factory at Luango. At this period, the trade of the colony, almost ruined by the abolition of the slave trade, was reduced to the export of ivory, palm oil, ground nuts, and mahogany. At the moment, this Portuguese, who had been a sailor, and was then about 50, commanded a small vessel named the Porto Alegre, engaged in the coasting trade. Barroso was possessed of a conscience so utterly devoid of scruples, and an audacity acquired in his old trade, that made him just the man Saouk wanted for his criminal machinations. When they reached the foot of this baobab, which the arms of 20 men could not have encircled, though it was nothing compared with the banyan of Muscat, they could talk without fear of being overheard, of anything they pleased that threatened the safety of Antifer and his companions. To begin with, they told each other how they had spent their lives since the Portuguese had left Egypt, and then Saouk came to business without beating about the bush. Although he took care not to let Barroso know the immense amount of treasure he was anxious to get hold of, he did not fail to tempt his cupidity with the bait of a considerable sum to be gained. "But," added he, "to help me, I want a man, resolute, courageous." "You know me, Excellency," replied the Portuguese, "and you know that I will stop at nothing." "If you have not changed." "I have not changed." "Know then that there are 4 men we must get rid of, and perhaps a 5th, if I find it necessary to disembarrass myself of a certain Ben Omar, whose clerk I am supposed to be, under the name of Nazim. One more makes little difference. In this case, certainly, and he will give you no trouble." "What are you going to do?" "This is my plan," replied Saouk, after looking about to see that he would not be overheard. 3 of these men are Frenchmen, a certain Captain Antifer, his friend and his nephew, and a Tunisian banker named Zambuco, just landed at Luango to take possession of a treasure deposited on one of the islands of the Gulf of Guinea. "Whereabouts?" "Near Mayumba Bay," replied the Egyptian. "Their intention is to travel up the coast to that town, and I think it would be easy to attack them as they are returning with their treasure, to wait for the steamer from St. Paul to Dakar." "Nothing easier," said Barroso. "I can find a dozen trusty fellows, always ready for business, who will be glad to assist you for an agreed sum." "I was sure of it, Barroso, and in these desert places we would be certain to succeed." "Of course, but I have a better plan to propose." "What is that?" "I am in command of a vessel of 150 tons, taking goods from one port to another along the coast. My ship is going to start in a couple of days for Baraka, on the Gaboon, a little to the north of Mayumba." "Ah, we might take advantage of that. Antifer would be only too pleased to take passage in her to avoid the fatigues and dangers of a land journey. You can land us at Mayumba, deliver your goods at the Gaboon, and return to pick us up. And while we are on the passage to Luango—" "That is understood." "How many men have you on board?" 12. "You can trust them?" "As myself." "And what are you taking to the Gaboon?" "A cargo of ground nuts, and 6 elephants, bought by a house at Baraka, which are to be sent on to a menagerie in Holland." "You do not speak French?" "No." "Do not forget that I am not supposed to speak it, or to understand it. I will tell Ben Omar to make the proposal to you, and Antifer will not hesitate to accept it." There could be no doubt of this, and there was every reason to fear that the 2 legatees would disappear with their companions during the return voyage across the Gulf of Guinea. And who could hinder the crime? And who would find out the authors? Luango is not under Portuguese rule, like Angola and Benguela. It is one of the independent kingdoms of the Congo, bounded by the Gaboon on the north and the Zaire on the south. But at this period, from Cape Lopez to Zaire, the native kings recognized the sovereign Luango and paid him tribute, generally in slaves. Such were Kassange, Tomba, Lebolo, and other vassals reigning over the much divided smaller territories. Society is regularly constituted among these Negroes. At the head, the king and his family, then the princes, that is, the sons of a princess, who alone can transmit nobility, then the husbands of the princesses, who are suzerains, then the priests, the fetishes, or yangas, of whom the chief is Chitomi by divine right, then the courtiers, the merchants, the retainers, that is to say, the people. As to slaves, there are many. There are too many. They are no longer sold to foreigners, it is true, owing to the consequences of European intervention in abolishing the trade. But although the king of Luongo is the monarch of a country that rejoices in independence, it does not follow that its roads are sufficiently guarded, and that travelers are free from peril. And so it would have been difficult to find a territory more favorable, or a sea more suitable for a foul action. This it was that made Jules so anxious, at least with regards to the land journey. If his uncle thought little about it, upset as he was, the young captain could not contemplate without serious alarm this land journey of 120 miles along the coast to Mayumba Bay. He thought it his duty to tell the bargeman of this. "What would you do, my boy?" replied Tregomain. "The cork is drawn, and we must drink the wine." "In fact," continued Jules, "it was only a promenade between Muscat and Sahar, and then we were in good company." "Could we not make up a caravan of natives at Luongo?" "I would no more trust these niggers than I would the hyenas and leopards and lions of the district." "Ah, are there plenty of these beasts?" "Plenty of them, to say nothing of lentas, which are venomous vipers, of cobras which spit their foam at your face, of pythons 30 feet long." "A nice place, my boy. Really, this excellent Pasha could not have chosen a more convenient one. And you think that these natives are not particularly intelligent, being like all the Congolese, but they are intelligent enough to rob and massacre the fools who venture in this abominable country." This fragment of dialogue gives a fair sample of the anxieties that Jules shared with Tregomain, and consequently they are both greatly relieved when Saouk, by means of Ben Omar, introduced the Portuguese Barroso to Captain Antifer and the Tunisian banker. No long stages across these dangerous countries, no fatigues in this excessive climate during so long a journey. As Saouk had said nothing of his previous connection with Barroso, and as Jules could have no suspicion that these two scoundrels had formerly known one another, his suspicions were not aroused. The voyage was to be by sea to Mayumba Bay. The weather was fine. They would be there in 2 days. The vessel would land the passengers, go on to Baraka, embark them on their return, and they would all go back to Luongo for the next steamer to take them to Marseille. Never had chance declared itself so clearly in favor of Captain Antifer. Of course, he would have to pay well for his passage, but what mattered the cost? There were 2 days to wait at Luongo, until the half-dozen elephants sent up from the interior were shipped on board the Porto Alegre. And so Tregomain and Jules, the former always anxious to learn, amused themselves by strolling through the town, the Banza as it was called in Congolese. Luongo, or Bouala, the old city, measuring about 2.5 miles in circumference, is built in the midst of a palm forest. It is composed of a collection of factories, surrounded by huts built of raffia twigs and covered with papyrus leaves. The traders are Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, Dutch, and German. Quite a mixture, as you see. But how new everything seemed to the bargemen. The Bretons on the banks of the Rance are not in the least like those half-naked natives, armed with bows and wooded swords and rounded axes. The king of Luongo, dressed up in a ridiculous old uniform, was not in the least like the prefect of Ile-et-Vilaine. The villages between St. Malo and Dinan had no such huts sheltered by huge coconut trees. And the people of St. Malo are not polygamous, like the idle Congolese, who leave all the heavy work to their wives and go to bed when their wives are ill. But the land in Brittany is not as fertile as the land in Luongo. Here it is only necessary to scratch the ground to obtain superb crops of manfrigo, or millet, with ears weighing half a pound, of holcus, which grows without culture, of luco, which is used for bread, of maize giving 3 crops a year, of rice, yams, manioc, tamba, lentils, tobacco, sugarcane in the marshy districts, vines in the neighborhood of the Zaire, imported from Canary and Madeira, figs, bananas, oranges, called mambrocas, lemons, pomegranates, kudes, fruit in the shape of pine cones, containing a floury melting substance, new bonzems, a kind of nut much liked by the Negroes, and pineapples that grow naturally on the desert spots. And then what huge trees! Mangroves, sandalwoods, cedars, tamarinds, palms, and a number of those baobabs, from which is extracted a vegetable soap, and a residuum much appreciated by the natives. And what a crowd of animals! Pigs, boars, zebras, buffalo, deer, gazelles, antelopes, elephants, jackals, porcupines, flying squirrels, wild cats, to say nothing of the innumerable varieties of monkeys, chimpanzees, ostriches, peacocks, thrushes, partridges, red and gray, edible locusts, bees, mosquitoes, kanzos, satoles, and cousins more numerable than desire. A wonderful country, whose wonders Tregamain would have exhausted if he had time to study its natural history. Neither Antifer nor Zamuco could have told you if Luongo was peopled by whites or blacks. No, their eyes looked elsewhere. They were searching far away more to the north, for an imperceptible point, a point unique in this world, a sort of enormous diamond with fascinating scintillations, weighing thousands of carats and worth millions of pounds. Ah, how impatient they were to set foot on island number 2 and reach the end of their adventurous campaign. On the 22nd of May, at sunrise, the vessel was ready to sail. The 6 elephants had arrived the night before, and been embarked with the necessary precautions. They were magnificent animals that would not have disgraced Sam Lockhart's service. It need scarcely be said that they were stowed in the hold. Maybe it was not very prudent to load a vessel of 150 tons with such masses, which might interfere with its equilibrium. Jules mentioned this to the bargeman. The vessel was, however, rather beamy and drew very little water, so as to enable her to come close in over the shallows. She had 2 masts, rather far apart, and was of square rig. For a vessel of this kind only sails well before the wind, and she is not very speedy, she can at least be safely worked within sight of the coast. Besides, the wind was favorable. At Luongo, as in all the countries of the Gulf, the rainy season, which begins in September, ends in May, under the influence of winds coming from the northwest. On the other hand, though it may be fine from May to September, how insupportable is the heat, which is only tempered a little by the abundant dew of the nights. Since they had landed, our travelers had melted and grown thinner visibly. More than 93 degrees in the shade. In this country, if we are to believe certain explorers, little worthy of faith, who ought to have been born in Bouches de Rhône or Gascony, the dogs were obliged to be continually on the move to prevent them from burning their paws on the incandescent soil. And wild boars are found actually cooked in their skins. Tregamain was almost inclined to believe these stories. The Port Alegre set sail at 8 o'clock in the morning. The passengers were all on board, men and elephants. The groups were as usual. Captain Antifer and Zambuco, more hypnotized than ever by this island number 2. And what a weight would be lifted from them when the lookout sighted it on the horizon. Tregamain and Jules, one forgetting the seas of Africa for the channel and the harbors of St. Malo, the other thinking of nothing but breathing the refreshing breeze. Saouk and Barroso talking together. And what was there to be astonished at, as they spoke the same language, and it was owing to their meeting that Antifer had obtained a passage on the vessel. The crew consisted of a dozen sturdy fellows, mostly Portuguese, and of very unprepossessing appearance. The uncle was absorbed in his thoughts and did not notice this, but the nephew remarked it, and communicated his impressions to the bargeman, who replied that in such temperatures it is hazardous to judge people by their looks, and that one must not be too particular with regard to the crew of an African vessel. With the prevailing wind, the voyage up the coast promised to be delightful. Portentosa Africa, Tregamain would have said if he had known the pompous epithet with which the Romans greeted this continent. In truth, if their thoughts had not been elsewhere, Captain Antifer and his companions, in passing the factory of Chaillu, would have abandoned themselves to the just admiration which the natural beauties of the coast deserved. Alone among them, the bargeman gazed at it like a man who wished to carry away with him some remembrance of his journey. And what could he have more splendid than a succession of green forests covering the hillsides, dominated here and there by the heights of the Strauch mountains, bathed with hot mists in their deep ravines. From mile to mile the beach ran back to give passage to the watercourses coming from the thick woods, which the tropical heats could not dry up. It is true that all this water did not reach the sea. Flocks of birds were gathered to drink of it. Peacocks, ostriches, pelicans, divers, animated the landscape with the beatings of their wings. Herds of graceful antelopes, troops of empalagas, or elans of the Cape, huge mammals capable of drinking a ton of this limpid water as easily as the bargeman could have tossed off a glass. Herds of hippopotamuses, looking at a distance like pink pigs, whose flesh, it seemed, is not despised by the natives. Tregamain, finding himself near Antifer in the bows, took occasion to remark, "Eh, my friend, hippopotamus feet, a la Santa Menamud. Will that do for you?" Antifer merely shrugged his shoulders and gave the bargeman one of those weary, vague looks which look at nothing. "He no longer understands what is said to him," murmured Tregamain, using his handkerchief as a fan. On the edge of the shore were troops of monkeys, leaping from one tree to another, howling and grimacing when, by a movement of the rudder, the Porto Alegre approached the beach. The birds, the hippopotamuses, and monkeys would have done no harm to our travelers if they had had to walk from Luango to Mayumba. No, what would have been a more serious danger was the presence of leopards and lions, which were seen bounding about the underwood, wonderfully supple brutes, anything but safe to meet with. When the night came, there were gruff howlings and lugubrious bayings to break the impressive silence which followed the fall of night. This concert reached the vessel like the moaning that precedes a storm. Troubled and excited, the elephants became restive in the hold, replying by savage grunts and shaking so as to make the vessel's timbers groan. Decidedly, the cargo was likely to cause uneasiness to the passengers. 4 days elapsed. Nothing occurred to break the monotony of the voyage. The fine weather continued. The sea was a dead calm, and Ben Omar felt no discomfort. There was no pitching, no rolling, and although the Porto Alegre was heavily laden, she was almost insensible to the long undulations of the surge, which died out in a light surf on the beach. For his part, the bargeman never imagined that a voyage at sea could be so quiet. "One would think we were on the Charmante Amélie, between the banks of the Rance," he said to his young friend. "Yes," objected Jules, "with this difference, that there was not on the Charmante Amélie a captain like this Barroso, and a passenger like this Nazim, whose intimacy with the Portuguese seems to me more and more suspicious." "And what do you think they are meditating, my boy?" replied Tregamain. "It will be too late, for we ought to be near our goal." In fact, at sunrise on the 27th of May, after doubling Cape Bonda, the Porto Alegre was within 20 miles of Mayumba. This Jules ascertained from Ben Omar, who at his request asked Sauk, who asked Barossa. They would arrive, then, that very evening in his little port of the Luango country. Already the coast began to curve in behind Point Matuti, describing a large bay, at the end of which the town was hidden. If island number 2 existed, if it occupied the place indicated in the document, it ought to be somewhere in this bay. And consequently, Antifer and Zambuco kept their eyes at the telescope, the glass of which they rubbed again and again. Unfortunately, the wind was light, the breeze almost gone. The Porto Alegre was hardly making 2 knots an hour. About 1 o'clock she rounded Point Matuti. There was a shout of joy on board. The future brothers-in-law had simultaneously sighted a series of islets in the bay. Surely the one they were in search of was one of the series? But which? That they would find out next day, when they observed the sun. 5 or 6 miles to the east, Mayumba appeared on a spit of sand between the sea and the Benya Brook, with its factories, its houses luminous among the trees. In front of the beaches were a few fishing boats, like large white birds. How calm was the surface of the bay! A canoe could not have been more tranquil on the surface of a lake. What shall we say, on the surface of a pond, or even on a large bowl of oil? The rays of the sun poured vertically down. Tregamain streamed like a fountain in a park on a festival day. The Porto Alegre drew nearer, thanks to a few intermittent puffs from the west. The islands in the bay became more distinct. There were 6 or 7 of them, like baskets of verdure. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the vessel was abreast of this archipelago. Antifer and Zambuco remained standing in the bows. Sauk, forgetting himself a little, could not hide his impatience, and justified by his manner the suspicions of Jules. These 3 men devoured with their eyes the first of these islands. Did they expect to see it spout up a shower of millions from its flanks as from a crater of gold? If they had known that the island in which Kamalik Pasha had buried his treasure was composed only of sterile rocks and bare stones, without a tree, without a shrub, no doubt they would have cried in despair, "No, it is not that one yet." But since 1831, there had been 31 years which nature had time to cover the island with masses of verdure. The Porto Alegre approached it slowly, so as to round its northern point, her sails barely filled with the dying evening breeze. If the wind fell altogether, they would have to anchor and wait for the daylight. But, suddenly, a lamentable groaning was heard at the bargeman's side. He turned to see what it was. It was Ben Omar. The notary was pale. He was livid. His heart was in his lips. He was seasick. What? In such calm weather? In this sleepy bay, without a furrow on its surface? Yes, and there was nothing surprising in the poor man being fearfully sick, for the vessel had begun to roll in a most absurd and inexplicable manner. She rolled to port, then to starboard in a most violent fashion. The crew rushed forward and rushed aft. Captain Barroso also ran. "What is it?" asked Jules. "What is the matter?" asked Tregamain. Was it some submarine eruption, the shocks of which threatened to sink the Porto Alegre? Neither Antifer, nor Zambuco, nor Sauk seemed to notice what was happening. "Ah!" exclaimed Jules. "The elephants!" Yes, it was the elephants who were making the ship roll. Under the influence of some inexplicable caprice, the idea occurred to them to bear all together, alternating on their hind feet and their forefeet. They made the vessel rock, and it seemed to please them, as it pleases the squirrel in his gyratory course in his revolving cage. But what squirrels, these huge pachyderms! The rolling increased. The taffrails nearly touched the water. The vessel was in danger of filling first on one side, then the other. Barroso and a few of the crew hurried down into the hold. They tried to calm the monstrous animals. There were shouts and blows, but no result. The elephants, brandishing their trunks, raising their ears, waggling their tails, got more excited, and more, the Porto Alegre rolled, until the water came pouring into her. It did not take long. In 10 seconds the sea had reached the hold, and down she went, while the screams of the foolish elephants were drowned in the abyss. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 25. "At last I have been shipwrecked," said Tregamain next morning. When the Porto Alegre had gone down, in 15 or 20 fathoms, the islet in Mayumba Bay, toward which she was nearest, became the refuge of those she carried. Nobody had perished in this extraordinary catastrophe. No one was missing from the roll call amongst the passengers or her crew. They had all helped each other. Antifer had held up Zambuco. Sauk had held up Ben Omar. They had only a few strokes to make to reach the rocks of the islet. Only the elephants had disappeared amid the element for which nature had not created them. They were drowned. After all, it was their fault. It does not do to make a boat into a seesaw. Antifer's first remark on landing had been, "And our instruments? And our charts?" Unfortunately, and the loss was irreparable, neither the sextant, nor the atlas, nor the nautical almanac had been saved, the disaster taking place in a few seconds. Fortunately, the banker and the notary and the bargeman carried in their belts the money required for the voyage, and there would be no difficulty in this respect. Neither had Tregamain had any difficulty in supporting himself in the water, the weight of the liquid displaced by his volume being greater than that of his body, and he tranquilly drifted ashore on the surge like a cetacean. It was easy to get dry. The clothes had only to be laid out in the sun for half an hour to become as dry as a bone. But there was a rather disagreeable night to be passed under the trees, every man abandoning himself to his own reflections. That they had arrived in the neighborhood of island number 2, there could be no doubt. But how were they to determine the exact spot where 3 degrees 17 minutes south latitude crossed 7 degrees 23 minutes east longitude, now that Jules had no sextant or chronometer and could not take an altitude? And so each of them, according to his character and aspirations, remarked to himself, Zambuco, this is sinking in sight of port. Antifer, I shall not go away until I have ransacked every island in this bay, if it takes me 10 years to do it. Sauk, well-laid scheme has failed, owing to this absurd shipwreck. Barroso, and those elephants were not insured. Ben Omar, Allah protect us, my commission will have cost me dear if I ever get it. Jules, there is nothing now to prevent me going back to Europe, to Annegate. Tregamain. Moral: never go to sea on a ship with a cargo of facetious elephants. Nobody slept very much that night. The shipwrecked ones might not suffer from cold. In what way would they, next morning at breakfast time, reply to the cravings of their hungry stomachs? At least, unless the trees were coconut trees laden with fruit, with which, for want of something better, they might support themselves until they reached Mayumba. But how were they to reach this town, which was 5 or 6 miles off? Make signals? Would they be seen? Swim 5 or 6 miles? Was there any one of the crew who could do that? Anyhow, when daylight came, the matter would have to be considered. There was no appearance that this island was inhabited, by human creatures be it understood. But there was no want of other living things, noisy, inconvenient, dangerous perhaps by their numbers. Tregamain had a notion that all the monkeys in creation had met on the island. Perhaps he had landed on the capital of the kingdom of Jaka, or Dracolia. And though the temperature was calm, and the surf hardly rippling on the beach, there was not an hour of peace to be enjoyed on the island. The silence was continuously troubled, and it had been impossible to sleep. There was a curious uproar among the trees. It seemed as though a troop of Congolese were playing on tom-toms. There was much running backwards and forwards under the branches and among the branches, with guttural cries from husky sentinels, the darkness of the night preventing anything being seen. When daylight came, the mystery was revealed. The island served as a refuge for a tribe of chimpanzees, and although they had troubled his sleep, Tregamain could not but admire these magnificent specimens of the anthropoid family. They were the very jacos or buffon, able to do many things ordinarily reserved for human hands and intelligence. Tall, strong, vigorous, prognathism of the face little marked, the ridges of the eyebrows almost normal. It was by distending their stomachs and rubbing them vigorously that they produced the drumming noise. There were about 50 of these chimpanzees who had taken up their abode on the island, but how they had got there from the mainland, how they had found sufficient food there, we leave to others to explain. Jules was not slow to discover that the island, measuring about 2 miles long and a mile wide, was covered with trees of a different kind common in tropical latitudes. No doubt these trees produced edible fruit, which gave the chimpanzees their means of existence. But the fruits, the roots, the vegetables on which the chimpanzees fed, man could feed on also. Of this, Jules, the bargemen, and the sailors all once took advantage. After a shipwreck, after a night without food, it is pardonable to be hungry and to seek for something to eat. The ground produced, in their wild state, a quantity of these fruits and roots. To eat them raw, however, is not very satisfying, unless you have the stomach of a chimpanzee. But you are not forbidden to cook them if you have the means of doing so. When you have a few matches, that is possible, if not easy. Fortunately, Nazim had renewed his supplies at Luango, and the brass box in which he kept them had not got wet inside. And consequently, almost as soon as the day broke, a wood fire was crackling under the trees of the encampment. The company was gathered round this fire. Antifer and Zambuco were as angry as ever. Doubtless, anger is nourishing, for they refused to share in the rudimentary breakfast, to which were added a few handfuls of the nuts the Guineans thought so much of. The chimpanzees also regaled themselves, and probably did not look kindly on these invaders on their island, these strangers who were attacking their reserves. Soon they began to draw in, and some of them capering about, the others at rest, but all grimacing violently, formed a circle round Captain Antifer and his companions. "We must be on our guard," said Jules to his uncle. "These chimpanzees are powerful fellows, 10 times more numerous than we are, and we are without arms." Antifer was not likely to care much about chimpanzees. "You are right, my boy," said the bargeman. "These fellows do not seem to be acquainted with the laws of hospitality, and their attitude is threatening." "Is there any danger?" asked Ben Omar. "The danger of being knocked to pieces," replied Jules seriously. At this reply the notary would have fled, but it was impossible. Barrasso, however, placed his men so as to repel any attack. Then Saouk and he began to talk privately, while Jules watched them. The subject of their conversation may be guessed. Saouk could not disguise his irritation at the thought of this unexpected shipwreck, having wrecked his plan. Another must be devised. As they had arrived in the vicinity of Island Number 2, no doubt the treasure of Camel Lake Pasha would be found on one of the islands in Mayumba Bay, either this or another one. But nothing could be done as yet. This was clear enough to the two scoundrels, so worthy of understanding each other. Of course, Barrasso would be well paid by his accomplice for the losses he had undergone, and the value of the vessel, her cargo, and the elephants would be restored to him. The main point was to get to Mayumba as soon as possible. A few fishing boats had just come away from the coast. They could be easily distinguished. The nearest was being sailed within 3 miles of the island. The wind was light, and she would not be in sight of the encampment for 3 or 4 hours, when they could signal for her. Before the day was over, they could all be installed in one of the factories of the town, where they could but receive a hearty welcome and liberal hospitality. Jewel! Jewel! This appeal suddenly interrupted the conversation between Sauk and the Portuguese. It was Captain Antifer who had made it, and it was followed by another. Gildas! Gildas! Jewel and the bargeman, who had gone to the beach to watch the maneuvers of the fishing boats, returned in reply to Antifer. Sambuca was with him, and Ben Omar, at a sign, approached. Leaving Barrasso to return to his men, Sauk came gradually nearer the group, so as to hear what was being said. As he had to be careful to let it be supposed that he did not understand French, nobody took much notice of his presence. Jewel, said Captain Antifer, listen, for the time has arrived to come to a decision. He spoke in a harsh, jerky voice, like a man in a paroxysm of irritability. The last document tells us that Island Number 2 is situated in Mayumba Bay. Now, we are in Mayumba Bay, are we not? There is no doubt of it. But we have no longer our sextant and chronometer, for this clumsy Tregamain, to whom I was fool enough to trust them, had lost them. My friend, said the bargeman. I would rather have got drowned than lost them, replied Antifer harshly. And so would I, added the banker. Indeed, Mr. Zambuco, retorted Tregamain with a gesture of indignation. Well, they are lost, continued Captain Antifer, and for want of the instruments it will be impossible, Jewel, to determine the position of Island Number 2. Impossible, uncle, and in my opinion the only wise thing to do is to go to Mayumba in one of those boats, return to Luango by land, and embark on the first steamer that puts in. That, replied Antifer, never. And the banker, like a faithful echo, repeated, never. Ben Omar, looking from one to the other, shook his head, as idiots do, and Sauk listened without seeming to understand. Yes, Jewel, we will go to Mayumba, but we will stay there instead of returning to Luango. We will stay there as long as it is necessary, understand me well, to visit the islands in the bay, every one of them. What? There are not many of them, 5 or 6. And if there were 100 or 1,000, I would search them one after the other. Uncle, that is not reasonable. Most reasonable, Jewel. One of them contains the treasure. The document indicates the position of the point where it is buried by Camel Lake Pasha. Confound the fellow, murmured Tregamain. With the will and the patience, continued Antifer, we shall end by discovering the spot marked by the double K. And if we do not find it? Asked Jewel. Do not say that, Jewel, exclaimed Antifer. For the sake of heaven, do not say that. And in a paroxysm of indescribable fury, his teeth ground the pebble between his jaws. Never had he been near an attack of congestion of the brain. Jewel did not think worthwhile to say any more, in face of such obstinacy. The search, which he thought would end in nothing, could not take much more than a fortnight. When Antifer had convinced himself that there was nothing to hope, he would, whether he liked it or not, have to return to Europe. So he replied, Let us be ready to embark in that fishing boat as soon as it comes ashore. Not without searching this island, replied Antifer. Why should we not begin with this one? The observation was logical. Who knew if the treasure seekers had not reached their goal without the aid of sextant and chronometer? Not very likely, you say. Perhaps so. But considering all the disappointments and fatigues and perils, why should not the goddess of fortune have shown herself propitious to her adorers? Jewel did not venture an objection. The best thing to do was to lose no time. The island might be searched before the fishing boat reached them. As soon as she came near the rocks, it was to be feared that the crew of the Porto Alegre would want to go on board in their haste to get a substantial meal in the factories of Mayumba. Why should they compel these men to submit to a delay, the cause of which could not be explained to them, To inform them of the existence of the treasure would be to put them in possession of the secret of Camel Lake Pasha. Nothing could be more reasonable, but when Antifer and Zambuco, accompanied by Jewel and Tregamain, the notary and Nazim, were leaving the camp, would not Barrasso and his men be rather surprised, and would they not be tempted to follow them? This was a serious difficulty. In case the treasure was discovered, what would this crew do at the exhumation of the casks, containing millions in gold, diamonds, and other precious stones? Might it not lead to scenes of violence and robbery with this mob of adventurers, not one of whom was worth the rope to hang him? Double as numerous as Antifer and his companions, they could soon overpower them, knock them about, and murder them. Certainly their captain would not try to restrain them. He would be more likely to lead them on, and claim the lion's share in the business. But to oblige Captain Antifer to act only with extreme prudence, to make him understand it would be better to wait a few days, to first reach Mayumba with a shipwrecked crew, and to return next day with a boat specially engaged for the trip, after getting rid of these suspicious fellows, was anything but easy. Jules' uncle would refuse to listen to reason. Never would they get him away until he had ransacked the island. No consideration would stop him. The bargeman was promptly sent to the right about when he offered these very observations to his intractable friend. The only reception he got was a broadside in 2 words. "Come on. I entreat you. Remain if you like. I can do without you. A little prudence. Come, Jewel." And he had to obey. Antifer and Zambuco left the camp. Tregamain and Jewel followed them. The men made no attempt to move. Barrasso did not seem to take any interest in the reason for the passengers walking off. How was this? It was because Sauk had heard all that passed, and having no wish to delay or hinder the search, had simply given the Portuguese the word. Barrasso turned to his crew and ordered them to wait at the point for the fishing boats, and not move away from the camp. And when this was done, Ben Omar, at a sign from Sauk, started after Antifer, who was not surprised at seeing the notary flanked by his clerk, Nazim. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe Denoya, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 26. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, to judge by the height of the sun above the horizon, and about with which we must be contented, owing to the watches having stopped on account of the immersion. If Barrasso's men had not followed the explorers, it was not so with the chimpanzees. A dozen of them left the troop with the evident intention of escorting the intruders. The others remained around the encampment. As he walked, the bargeman looked sideways at the savage bodyguard, who answered him with abominable grimaces and threatening gestures and gruff exclamations. Evidently, he thought, these brutes are talking amongst themselves. I am sorry I cannot understand them. It would be a pleasure to converse in their language. An excellent opportunity this, to make philological observations, and ascertain if, as Garner the American says, the higher apes have vocal sounds expressive of their different ideas, such as wh for food, chi for drink, eek for take care. In fact, if in the simian tongue a and o are missing, I is rare, e little used, and u and ou are the fundamental vowels. It will not have been forgotten that the document found on the island in the Gulf of Oman gave the particulars of the island in Mayumba Bay, and mentioned the position in which the sign of the double K marked the site of the treasure. On the first island, it was on a promontory to the south that the search had to be made and was made. On the second island, on the contrary, it was on one of the northern capes that one of the rocks bore the monogram. It was on the southern side that the shipwreck had occurred. Consequently, the exploring party had to march northward a distance of about a couple miles. There was nothing surprising in the 2 legatees being in advance of the group. They walked quickly, without exchanging a word, and would have allowed none of their companions to get in front of them. Every now and then, the notary gave an uneasy look at Sauk. He had no doubt but that he had arranged some villainy with the Portuguese captain. There was one thought he could not get rid of, that if Antifer lost the treasure, his commission would probably go the same way. Once or twice he tried to talk to Sauk, but Sauk, with gloomy eye and angry look, feeling himself perhaps watched by Jewel, did not reply. In fact, Jules' mistrust was greatly increased when he noticed how Ben Omar treated Nazim. Even in an Alexandrian office, it is not customary for the clerk to command and the notary to obey, and there could be no doubt that it was with these two personages. The bargeman thought of nothing but the chimpanzees. Now and then his good-looking face would respond to their grimaces. His eye would close, his nose turn up, his lips protrude. Nonan and Enogate would certainly not have recognized him when he abandoned himself to these simian distortions. Enogate. Ah, poor child. Assuredly at this moment she was thinking of Jules, for she was always thinking of him. But that this very day he had been shipwrecked and was marching amid an escort of chimpanzees. Never, no, never could she have imagined that. In this latitude, at this time of year, the sun describes a semicircle from east to west as it passes near the zenith. Consequently, the rays it projects in these countries are not oblique, but perpendicular. The torrid zone is well named, for the zone is literally torrified from dawn to eve. And these jokers do not seem to be warm, said the bargeman, looking at the chimpanzees. It is enough to make you wish you were an ape. To avoid the solar rays, it might have been worthwhile to advance under the trees, but their trunks began to branch so low down that the forest seemed impenetrable. Unless you were an ape, as Tregamain wished to be, and could travel among the branches, it would have been impossible to have found a passage. And so it was along the shore that Antifer went, skirting the creeks, avoiding the high rocks rising here and there like menhirs, and stumbling over the stones where you could not find any on the sandy beach clear of the rising tide. Is it not a difficult road, hard to the feet and rough to travel, which leads to fortune? He might sweat blood and water if necessary, but it would not be too much if he was to be eventually paid at the rate of £1,000 for every step he took in approaching his goal. An hour after they left camp, they had only gone a mile. That is, half as far as they wanted. From this place, the northern points on the island were visible. 3 or 4 ran out from the rest. Which was the right one? Unless they were exceptionally fortunate, they would probably have to search them all under the terrific meridian heat. The bargeman was quite done up. "Let us rest a moment," he entreated. "Not a moment," replied Captain Antifer. "But, uncle," said Jules, "Tregamain is visibly melting." "Let him melt." "Thank you, my friend." And at this reply, Tregamain, who did not want to remain behind, resumed his march. It took another half hour before they reached the place where the 4 points branched out. The difficulties of the road increased. Some of the obstacles appeared insurmountable. What an indescribable chaos of shingle and ridges of quartz. Really, the place had been well chosen, and Camalik had had a happy knack of hiding treasure, which might have been envied by the monarchs of Bassora, Baghdad, and Samarkand. Here ended the wooded part of the island. Evidently, the chimpanzees had no intention of going further. They did not willingly leave the shelter of trees, and the sound of roaring waves has no attraction for them. When the escort stopped at the edge of the trees, it was not without manifesting intentions that they were anything but conciliatory with regards to the strangers who were pursuing their explorations toward the extremity of the island. What howls they uttered! One of them picked up some stones and threw at them, and as the others followed his example, there was some danger of Antifer and his companions being stoned to death. And this is probably what would have happened if they had been imprudent enough to reply, as they were not equal to their aggressors either in strength or number. "Do not reply! Do not reply!" shouted Jules, seeing Tregamain and Saouk picking up some stones. "Nevertheless," said the bargeman, whose hat had been knocked off by a stone. "No, Tregamain, no! Come further away, and we shall be safe. They will not come any further after us." This was the best to do. 50 yards more and they would be out of range of the stones. It was then 10:30. To the north, 3 points ran out into the sea for 150 or 200 yards. It was the longest one, to the northwest, that Antifer and Sambuco decided to visit first. Nothing could be more barren than this mass of rocks, some of them firmly buried in the sand, others scattered and rolled about by the sea during the bad weather. No trace of vegetation, not even of lichens coating the humid blocks, not even a scrap of seaweed, so abundant on the shores of the temperate zones. There was nothing to fear with regard to the monogram of Camalik Pasha. If it had been inscribed on one of these rocks 31 years before, it would certainly be found intact. Our explorers began their search exactly as they had done that on the island in the Gulf of Oman. It may hardly be believed, but the two legatees were so possessed by their passion that they seemed to suffer no fatigue from their trying march under the burning sun. And Saouk, in the interest of his master, for who would have imagined it was for his own sake, set to work with indefatigable zeal. The notary sat between two rocks, and neither moved nor spoke. If they discovered the treasure, there would be time enough for him to intervene and claim the commission to which, being present, he was entitled by the provisions of the will, and he certainly would not be overpaid, considering the tribulations he had undergone during 3 long months. We need hardly say that by Captain Antifer's orders, Jules remained near him, and began a methodical examination of every foot of the ground. It is not very likely, he said to himself, that we shall find the millions here. First, it is necessary that the treasure is buried on this island, and not on one of the other islands of the bay. Secondly, it must be buried on this point. Thirdly, we have got to find among the massive rocks one that bears the double K. But if all these circumstances combine, if it is not a hoax on the part of the abominable Pasha, if I put my hand on the monogram, would it not be better to say nothing about it? My uncle would then give up this deplorable idea of marrying me to a duchess, and Enoggate to a duke. Well, no. My uncle would never recover from such a blow. He would go out of his mind. My conscience would tell me I had acted dishonorably. I must go on with this thing. And while Jules was indulging in these reflections, the bargeman was seated on a piece of rock with his arms swaying, his legs hanging down, his cheeks streaming, puffing like a seal come to the surface after prolonged immersion. The investigations proceeded without result. Antifer, Zambuco, Jules, and Saouk hunted about, patting all the rocks which by their position might bear the precious monogram. In vain were 2 wearisome hours devoted to this operation, up to the very end of the point. Nothing. Nothing. And, indeed, was it likely that a place would have been chosen exposed to the beatings of the surf and the violence of the waves? No. After the search was over on this promontory, would they resume it on the others? Yes, they would resume them the next day, and Antifer would recommence his work on another island if he failed on this one. Having found no trace, the group returned from the point, examining the rocks and the sand as they came. But there was nothing. At present, the only thing to do was to get back to the camp, embark on one of the boats, and cross to Mayumba. As Antifer, Zambuco, Jules, and Saouk came back from their search, they saw the bargeman and the notary still where they had left them. Antifer and Zambuco, without uttering a word, went toward the edge of the forest, where the chimpanzees were waiting for them. Jules rejoined Tregamain. Well? Asked the bargeman. Not a sign of a double, or even a single K. Then we must get back? Just so. Get up. Let us be off to the camp. Get up? Yes, if I can. Come, give me a hand, my boy. And with a vigorous haul from Jules, Tregamain rose to his feet. Ben Omar was already upright near Saouk. Antifer and Zambuco were 20 yards in front. From gestures and clamors, the chimpanzees took to action. A number of stones were thrown, and it became necessary to stand on the defensive. Evidently, these wretched chimpanzees intended to prevent Antifer and his companions rejoining Barroso and his men at camp. Suddenly a shout was heard. It came from Ben Omar. Had the notary been hit by a stone in some sensitive part of his person? No. It was not a cry of grief that escaped him. It was a cry of surprise, almost a cry of joy. They all stopped. The notary, with his mouth open and his eyes shut, stretched out his hand at Tregamain. There, he said. There! What do you mean? Asked Jules. Have you gone mad, Ben Omar? No, there! The K! The double K! Replied the notary, in a voice choked with emotion. The K? The double K! They exclaimed. Yes. Where? And they looked at a rock toward which Ben Omar seemed to be pointing, but they saw nothing. But where, you animal? Asked Antifer, in a voice of fury. There, replied the notary. His hand pointed at the bargeman, who turned and shrugged his shoulders. See it? Said Ben Omar. On his back. In fact, on Tregamain's jacket there was a clear enough impression of the double K. Probably the rock against which he had been leaning bore the monogram, of which the worthy man had taken an impression on his back. Antifer gave a great leap, seized the bargeman by his arm, and ordered him to return to the place where he had been sitting. The rest followed, and in less than a minute they were in front of a block of stone, on which the much sought-for monogram was perfectly legible. Not only had Dragamine sat with his back up against the rock, but he had sat right down on the place where the treasure was hidden. No one spoke a word. They set to work. For want of tools, the task would be difficult. Could they clear away these rocks with their pocket knives? Fortunately, the stones, eroded by the weather, could be pulled asunder without much difficulty. In an hour they might have the barrels in sight. Then they would only have to take them to the camp, and then to Mayumba. This transport might probably be difficult, and how could it be carried out without awakening suspicion? Bah! Who was going to think about that? The treasure first. The treasure from the tomb where it had been buried for a third of a century. They could see about the other things afterwards. Antifer worked till his hands bled. He would not abandon to another the delirious joy of feeling, of patting the precious casks. At last, he cried as his knife snapped against a metallic surface. And then, what a yell there was! Good heavens! Not joy, but stupefaction, disappointment. Did his white face show? Instead of the barrels mentioned in Kamalik Pasha's will, there was an iron box, a box like that found on Island Number 1, with the monogram as usual. Again? Joel could not help exclaiming. It must be a hoax, murmured Dragamine. The box was pulled out of the hole, and Antifer opened it savagely. A document appeared, an old parchment, yellow with age, on which were traced these lines, which Captain Antifer read in a loud voice. Longitude of Island Number 3, 15 degrees, 11 minutes east. After being noted by the co-legatees Antifer and Zambuco, this longitude is to be taken and communicated in the presence of the notary Ben Omar to Mr. Tyrcomel of Edinburgh, Scotland, who possessed the latitude of the third island. Then it was not in Mayumba Bay that the treasure was buried. They would have to search elsewhere on the globe by combining this new longitude with the latitude of said Tyrcomel of Edinburgh. And there were not two to share Kamalik Pasha's legacy, but three. And why, exclaimed Jewel, should we not be sent from this third island to 20 others, to 100 others? Come, uncle, are you so obstinate, so foolish as to run about all over the world? Without reckoning, said Dragamine, that if Kamalik Pasha had made legatees by the 100, his legacy will not be worth troubling about. Antifer looked down on his friend and his nephew, gave him a pebble to grind in his jaw, and replied, Silence in the ranks. We have not got to the end yet. And straightening out the document, he read as follows. Up to the present, at some compensation for their trouble and expenses, the co-legatees are to each take one of the 2 diamonds deposited in this box, the value of which is insignificant compared with that of the other precious stones they are asked to search for. Zambuco threw himself on the box, which he snatched from Antifer's hands. Diamonds! He shouted. And there were in fact 2 magnificent diamonds, worth, so the banker said, 4,000 pounds the pair. It is quite that, said he, taking one of the diamonds and handing the other to his co-legatee. A drop of water in the ocean, said Antifer, slipping the diamond into one pocket and the document into another. Ahem, said the bargeman, shaking his head. This is becoming more serious than I thought. We shall see. We shall see. But Jewel merely shrugged his shoulders, and Saul clenched his hands at the thought that never again would he have such a favorable opportunity. As to Ben Omar, who had not had the smallest brilliant for his share, in spite of the obligation laid on him by this third document, he stood there with his features drawn, his arms limp, his knees shaking just like a half-empty sack about to flatten out on the ground. It is true that Sauk and he were not in the same position as they were when they left St. Malo, ignorant that they were going to Muscat, or when they had left Muscat, ignorant that they were going to Luongo. Carried away by regrettable excitement, Antifer had let slip the secret he should have rigorously concealed. They had all heard the new longitude, 15 degrees 11 minutes east, and they had all heard the name of Mr. Tyrcomel, residing at Edinburgh in Scotland. We may be certain that if Ben Omar had not done so, Sauk had already engraven these figures and this address in his memory until he could write them in his pocketbook, and Antifer and the banker would have to be careful not to lose sight of the notary, or his clerk with the mustaches, if they did not want them to outstrip them on their journey to Edinburgh. There might be some reason for thinking that Nazim had not understood, as he did not understand French, but there was no doubt that Ben Omar would reveal the secret to him. And besides, Joel had noticed that Nazim had not concealed a feeling of satisfied curiosity when the figures of the longitude and the name of Turcomel had so imprudently escaped the lips of Captain Antifer. After all, what did it matter? In his opinion, it would be madness to submit again for the third time to the posthumous fancies of Camel Pasha. What ought to be done was to return to Luongo and take the first steamer on their way to the good town of St. Malo. Such was the wise and logical proposition that Jewel made to his uncle. "Never," replied Captain Antifer. "The Pasha sends us to Scotland. We will go to Scotland. And if I devote the rest of my life to this search—" "My sister Talisma," added the banker, "loves you too well not to wait for you, even for 10 years. Goodness, thought Tregamain, the young lady will be nearly 60. Observations were useless. Antifer had made up his mind. He would continue in pursuit of the treasure, although the legacy was reduced to a third by the participation of Mr. Turcomel. Well, Enegate would have to be content to marry an earl, and Jewel a countess. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 27. The possession of wealth leads almost inevitably to its abuse. It is the chief, if not the only cause of all the evils which desolate the world below. The thirst for gold is responsible for the most regrettable lapses into sin. Imagine a society in which there were neither rich nor poor. What evils, afflictions, sorrows, disorders, catastrophes, disasters, tribulations, misfortunes, agonies, calamities, despair, desolation, and ruin would be unknown to man. It was the 25th of June. The church was in Edinburgh. The preacher was the Reverend Mr. Turcomel. His eloquent address had lasted for an hour, and the attention of his congregation gave no signs of failing. The gospel tells us, he continued, that blessed are the poor in spirit, a profound axiom that the ignorant and irreligious have in vain sought to misunderstand. It does not say that those who are poor of spirit, imbeciles in a word, but those who are poor in spirit, and despise those abominable riches which are the source of evil in modern society. The gospel tells us to despise wealth, and if unfortunately we are afflicted with a superfluity of wealth, if silver is stored in your treasure chests, if gold flows into you, if diamonds and precious stones cling to your necks, your arms, your fingers like an unhealthy eruption, if you are among those whom men call happy in this world, although I think you are thereby unhappy, I say to you that your malady requires instant and energetic treatment if you wish to be saved. And the preacher, continuing, told his hearers that their only chance of safety lay in the giving their riches over to destruction. He did not say, distribute your wealth among the poor, give to those who have none. No, what he preached was the destruction of this gold and these diamonds and title deeds and bonds and shares, either by burning them in the fire or casting them into the water. In short, the Reverend Mr. Turcomel would have no compromise with the habits and customs of the world in which he lived. In appearance he was a man of about 50, tall, thin, smooth-faced, with piercing eyes and a voice as penetrating as that of a preaching friar. Throughout the city he was well known. There were some who thought he was inspired. The people crowded to his sermons. Hearers he had many. Proselytes he had none. They listened, but they acted not. Among his listeners on this occasion were 5 strangers who knew nothing of English, and would have known nothing of his discourse if a 6th stranger had not explained it to them. The 6 were, of course, Captain Antifer and Zambuco, Ben Omar and Sauk, Tregamain and Jewel. We left them on the island in Mayumba Bay on the 28th of May. We meet them again here in Edinburgh on the 25th of June. What has happened between these dates? After the discovery of the second document, all that could be done was to abandon the island to the chimpanzees, to avail themselves of the boat which had been attracted by the signals of the shipwrecked crew. Captain Antifer and his companions had returned along the shore, escorted by the chimpanzees, more demonstrative than ever, howling, growling, and grimacing, and every now and then assailing the explorers with volleys of stones. The camp was reached at last. A word or two from Sauk to Barroso told him that the plot had failed. It was impossible to steal treasure from those who had no treasure to steal. The boat moored in a little creek near the camp, took on board all the survivors of the Porto Alegre. 2 hours later, she dropped anchor off the sandy spit on which stands Mayumba. Our travelers, without distinction of nationality, were hospitably received at a French factory. They at once set out arranging for their return to Luongo. Joining a party of Europeans on their way thither, they had neither to fear from the wild beasts or the natives. But the heat was almost unbearable. When they arrived, the bargeman said that he was reduced to a skeleton. It was an exaggeration, of course, but it was not far from the truth. Luckily, Captain Antifer and his companions did not have to remain at Luongo very long. A Spanish steamer from San Paul de Luanda, bound for Marseille, happened to put in 2 days afterwards for repairs, which were effected in a day. Berths were booked on the steamer, with some of the money saved from the wreck, and on the 15th of June, Captain Antifer and his companions left the west coast of Africa, where they found 2 valuable diamonds, a new document, and a new disappointment. As to Captain Barroso, Sauk undertook to pay him later on, when he had got hold of the Pasha's millions, and the Portuguese had to be content with the promise. Jules made no attempt to argue with his uncle, although he fully expected that the campaign would end in some gigantic mystification. A change, however, began to come over the bargeman's opinion. Those 2 diamonds contained in the box on island number 2 had given him something to think about. If the Pasha, he said to himself, has made us a present of these 2 diamonds, why should we not find some more on island number 3? And when he talked to Jules in this way, Jules would shrug his shoulders and say, "Well, we shall see. We shall see." This was Antifer's opinion. As the 3rd legatee, the possessor of the latitude of the 3rd island, lived in Edinburgh. To Edinburgh he would go, and he had no intention of letting himself be outstripped in the race, thither by either Zambuco or Ben Omar, who knew the longitude, 15 degrees, 11 minutes east, which was to be communicated to Mr. Turcomel. He would not part company with them. They would go together to Edinburgh by the quickest possible way, and Mr. Turcomel would be visited by the whole of them. Of course, this resolve was not satisfactory to Sauk. He was now in possession of the secret, and he would much rather have acted alone, found the man mentioned in the document, obtained a position of the 3rd island, gone there, and dug up the riches of Kamalik Pasha. But he could not get away without awakening suspicion, and he knew that he was being watched by Jules. Besides, the only way he can go was by Marseille, and as Antifer was going to Edinburgh by the shortest way, and in the shortest time, by traveling on the railways of France and England, so could not hope to get there before him. He had therefore to resign himself to the inevitable. Once matters had been cleared up with this Mr. Turcomel, perhaps the attempt, which had failed at Luongo and Muscat, might succeed in Edinburgh. The passage was fairly quick, as the steamer made no calls at the byports. It was rough, certainly, and of course Ben Omar was landed like a package on the quay of La Joliette. Jules had written a long letter to Enoch. He told her all that had happened at Luongo. He informed her of the new campaign on which their uncle's obstinacy was sending them. And who could say where the caprice of the Pasha might send them in the future? He added that as far as he could see, Captain Antifer was quite equal to running about the world like a wandering Jew, and that he would not stop until he was raving mad, which would assuredly happen before all was over. Jules had only just time to slip this letter into the post. Antifer was off in the fast train from Marseille to Paris, then by the express from Paris to Calais, then by boat to Dover, then from Dover to London, and then by the Flying Scotchman from London to Edinburgh. As soon as they had secured their rooms at Gibbs Royal Hotel, they started out in search of Mr. Turcomel, and to their great surprise, Mr. Turcomel turned out to be a minister. They found his address, and then found out that he was at the church, and to the church they went. Their intention was to introduce themselves to him when the sermon was over, to tell him their story. A man to whom they were bringing $1 million or so was not likely to complain at being intruded upon. At the same time, it all seemed rather strange. What connection could have existed between Camel Pasha and the Scottish minister? Antifer's father had saved the Egyptian's life. Well. Zambuco had saved his riches. Well. Hence the feeling of gratitude he had shown towards these two. Were they to conclude that Mr. Turcomel possessed a similar right to recognition? Evidently. But under what peculiar circumstances could a minister have helped Camel Pasha in any way? It must be so, however, for this minister was the depository of the third latitude necessary for the discovery of the third island. But when the treasure seekers saw the minister in the pulpit, it was evident that some other explanation would have to be sought for. He could not have been more than 22 when Camel was thrown into prison at Cairo by order of Muhammad Ali, and it was not likely that he could have rendered him any service before then. Was it his father, or his grandfather, or uncle who had put the Egyptian under an obligation? However, it was of no importance. The point was that this minister possessed the precious latitude, that before the day was out, they would know all about it. The sermon continued, the same thesis, with the same impassioned eloquence. An invitation to kings to throw their civil lists into the sea. An invitation to queens to throw their diamonds into the flames. An invitation to the rich to destroy every scrap of their wealth. Jules sat astounded, muttering to himself. Here is another complication. Decidedly, Uncle will have no chance with this man. Can this be the sort of man the Pasha knew? Is it from this excited minister that we are to ask the means of discovering a treasure? This man would be only too eager to destroy it, and if it ever fell into his hands. Here's an obstacle we never expected, an insurmountable obstacle, which will bring our proceedings to a close. We shall get a peremptory refusal, a refusal to which we cannot reply, a refusal which will bring the reverend gentleman immense popularity. That will settle my uncle, and his mind will give way. Zambuco and he, and perhaps this Nazim, will do all they dare to get the secret of the minister. They are capable of everything. But if he keeps the secret? I do not know if, as he says, millions do not bring happiness, but running after those of the Egyptians certainly delayed mine. And if Mr. Turcomel refuses to cross this latitude with our longitude, which we have conquered at so much trouble, we can do nothing else than retire tranquilly to France, and... When God commands, we must obey, said the preacher at this moment. That is my opinion, thought Jules, and my uncle will have to submit. But the sermon did not end, and there seemed no reason why it should not last until eternity. Antifer and the banker began to give visible marks of impatience. Saouk bit his mustache. The notary, so long as he was not on shipboard, did not worry himself about anything. Tregamain, with his mouth open, his head nodding, his ears pricked up, tried to catch a word here and there, which he vainly endeavored to translate. If, said Antifer, he only knew the news I am bringing him, this preacher would soon get out of his pulpit. Would he? Asked Jules, in a tone so singular that Antifer frowned at him in a terrible way. But all things must end in this world, even a Scottish sermon. It had become evident that Mr. Turcomel had reached his peroration. His delivery became more labored, his gestures more violent, his metaphors more audacious, his objurgations more menacing. One more blow against the fortune holders, the possessors of the vile metal, with an injunction to throw it into the furnace of this world if they would avoid being hurled into that of the next, and then a supreme effort to the effect that when they were weighed in the balance, the weight of their gold would sink them to perdition. The sermon was over, and the preacher as suddenly disappeared. Captain Antifer, Zambuco, and Saouk had intended to interview him as he came out of church. Would they have to wait until the morning? Were they to pass the night in the tortures of curiosity? No, they would rush to the central porch. Jules and the notary and Tregamain followed them, but their endeavor was in vain. Evidently, Mr. Turcomel, to avoid an ovation, had escaped by a side door. To 17 North Bridge Street, said Captain Antifer. But, uncle... Before he goes to bed, we must see him, said the banker. But, Mr. Zambuco... No remarks, if you please. There is only one thing. What is that? Asked Antifer angrily. What he has been preaching about. And what has that to do with us? A good deal. You are making fun of us. I am quite serious, and I say that nothing could be more unfortunate for you. For me? Yes. Listen. And in a few words, Joel had explained what had been the purport of the sermon, that all the millions in the world ought to be thrown into the sea. The banker was aghast, and so was Sauk, although he pretended not to understand. As for Tregamain, he indulged in a huge grimace of disappointment. Antifer alone remained unshaken. In a tone of bitter irony, he remarked, "Fool! The only people who preach like that are those who have not a halfpenny to lose. We've only got to talk about the millions that are coming, and you will see if this Turcoman will throw them into the sea." Evidently, this reply betrayed a profound knowledge of human nature. But it was decided to give up the idea of visiting this reverend gentleman that evening, when the 6 travelers returned to Gibbs Royal Hotel. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Joe Denoya, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 28. The house in which Mr. Turcomel lodged was in the neighborhood of Canongate, the windows looking out onto the valley in which runs the railway. It was a gloomy, uncomfortable house, up one of those sordid, insanitary alleys known as closes, running out of this historic thoroughfare, which, under different names, extends from the Palace of Holyrood to the Castle of Edinburgh, one of the 4 Scottish fortresses which by the Articles of the Treaty of Union have always to be kept in repair. It was at the door of this house that on the morning of the 26th of June, Captain Antifer and the banker Zambuco, accompanied by Jewel, arrived, just as 8 o'clock was striking from the neighboring church. Ben Omar had not been asked to join them, his presence being useless at this first interview, and consequently, much to his disgust, Sauk was also absent. If the minister divulged the secret of the latitude, he would not be there to hear it, and it would therefore be impossible for him to outstrip Antifer in the search for island number 3. As to the bargeman, he remained at the hotel, and, while awaiting the return of the visitors, amused himself by contemplating the marvels of Princess Street and the pretentious elegancies of the Scott Monument. As far as Jewel was concerned, it had not been possible to dispense with him, as his uncle required his services as interpreter. It could be imagined how eager they were to find where island number 3 was situated. Sauk, it may be observed, was furious when he found himself left behind, and as usual vented his anger on Ben Omar. "Yes, it is your fault," he shouted, knocking over some of the furniture, "and I have a great mind to pay you out with a good thrashing." "Excellency, I did all I could." "No, you did not do all you could. You should have forced yourself on this rascally sailor, and told him that your presence was necessary, and that you would be there. You would then have found out and told me about this new island, and I might have perhaps got there before the others. My plans were spoiled at Muscat. They were spoiled at Mayumba. Do you think they're going to fail again because you remain stuck there on your feet like an old ibis stuffed with straw? I beg, and I swear that if I fail, it is your skin that will pay for it." The scene continued in this way, and became so violent that the bargeman heard the noise. He went to the door of the room, and was lucky for Zouk that he was speaking in Egyptian. If he had assailed Ben Omar in French, Tregamain would have discovered his abominable schemes, and learned who the so-called Nazim really was, and treated that personage as he deserved. But although this was not revealed to him, he was thoroughly surprised at the violence with which Ben Omar was treated by his clerk, and saw that the young captain's suspicions were fully justified. Entering the minister's house, Captain Antifer, Zambuco, and Jewel began to ascend a wooden staircase with the aid of the greasy rope hanging on the wall. Never would the bargeman, thin as he might have become, have been able to make his way up these dark, narrow stairs. The visitors reached the landing on the 3rd floor, the last on this side of the house. In front of them was a small door in a recess, of which was the name Turcomel. Antifer uttered a vigorous grunt of satisfaction, and knocked. The reply was a long time coming. Was not the minister at home? Why not? A man to whom you are bringing $1 million or so. A second knock, rather louder than the first. This time there was a slight noise in the interior of the room. It was not the door that opened, but a little hole just above the name. Through this hole appeared a head, that of the minister. "What do you want?" asked the minister, in a tone that showed he was not overpleased at being disturbed. "We wish to speak to you for a few minutes," said Jules. "What about?" "A matter of important business." "I have no business, important or otherwise." "Ah!" exclaimed Antifer, annoyed at so much delay. "Is he going to let us in?" But as soon as the minister heard him speak in French, he answered as if it were his native tongue. "Are you a Frenchman, then?" "Frenchman," replied Jules. And imagining that I might facilitate their introduction into the minister's room, he added, "Frenchman, who heard your sermon yesterday." "And who think of becoming converts to my teaching?" asked the minister. "Perhaps." "On the contrary," said Antifer, "he must be converted to ours, unless he chooses to give up his share." The door was opened, and the three visitors found themselves in the minister's presence. It was one room, lighted at the end by the window looking out over the ravine. In one corner was an iron bedstead, with a straw mattress and a counterpane. In another corner was a table with a few toilet utensils. There was a bench for a seat. There was a cupboard in which the minister kept his clothes. On a shelf were a few books and writing materials. There were no curtains, and the walls were bare. There was a table with a reading lamp, the shade of which was very low. It was a bedroom and a study, in which there was nothing that was not strictly necessary. The minister, who was all in black except his collar and tie, did not ask his visitors to sit down, and he had but one seat to offer them. In truth, if ever millions would be welcome anywhere, it ought to be in this cell, the whole contents of which are not worth 30 shillings. Captain Antifer and Zambuco looked at one another. How were they to open fire? As soon as their co-legatee began to speak French, Jules' intervention was unnecessary, and they became merely a spectator. He preferred to be so, and it was not without a certain feeling of curiosity that he awaited the encounter. Who would be the conqueror? At the outset, Captain Antifer felt more embarrassed than he had ever expected to be. After what he knew of this revolutionary minister, of his opinions regarding this world's goods, he judged it advisable to proceed with caution, to feel his way, to break the news gently, so as to persuade the minister to hand over the letter of Kamalik Pasha, which ought to be in his possession, and which there could be no doubt contained the figures of the new and, let us hope, the last latitude. But Antifer had no chance of beginning. Whilst three visitors were forming a group in the back of the room, the minister placed himself in front of them in the attitude of a preacher. Persuaded that these men had come of their own free will to accept his teaching, his only thought was to enlarge on his principles with as much eloquence as he could muster. "My brethren," he said, clasping his hands in an outburst of gratitude, "I thank the author of all things for not having refused me that gift of persuasion, which has enabled me to instill in your hearts that contempt of wealth. Imagine the faces of the two legatees at this exordium. By destroying the wealth you possess," continued the minister, "which we do not yet possess," Antifer could not help saying, "you will give an admirable example, which will be followed by all those whose minds are capable of rising above the materialities of life." Antifer, by a sudden movement of his jaw, jerked a pebble from one side of his mouth to the other, while Zambuco whispered, "Are you not going to explain the object of our visit?" An affirmative sign was Antifer's reply, while he muttered to himself, "I must not let him give us his yesterday's sermon over again." The minister, opening his arms as if to receive repentant sinners, said in a full voice of unction, "Your names, my brethren, in order that—" "Our names, Mr. Turcomel," interrupted Captain Antifer, "are these. I am Pierre Servan Malo Antifer, retired coasting captain. This is Jules Antifer, my nephew, master mariner. This is Mr. Zambuco, banker of Tunis." The clergyman stepped to the table in order to write down these names. "And doubtless you bring me your worldly wealth, thousands perhaps?" "Well, Mr. Turcomel, we have come about millions, and when you've got your share, you can destroy it as you please. But as far as we are concerned, that is another matter. Antifer was off on the wrong tack. Jules and Zambuco saw this at once by the change which took place in the minister's face. His forehead wrinkled, his eyes half-turned. His arms, which he had opened wide, fell on his chest as if they were shutting the door of a safe. "What, then, is all this about, gentlemen?" he asked, stepping back. "What is it all about?" asked Antifer. "Come, Jules, unroll the thing, for I should not be able to measure my words." And Jules unrolled the thing without reticence. He related all he knew about Camelic Pasha, the services rendered by his great-uncle Thomas Antifer, the obligations contracted with the banker Zambuco, the visit to St. Malo of Ben Omar, notary of Alexandria, the voyage to the Gulf of Oman, where lay island number 1, followed by the voyage to Mayumba Bay, where lay island number 2, the discovery of the second document, which sent the 2 co-legatees to a third legatee, who was no other than the reverend gentleman to whom he was speaking. While Jules spoke, the clergyman listened, without making a movement, without permitting his eyes to brighten or his muscles to twitch. A statue of marble or bronze could not have been more motionless. And when the young captain finished his story and asked him if he ever had any business with Camelic Pasha, the minister simply replied, "No." "But your father?" "Maybe." "Maybe is not an answer," observed Jules, calming his uncle, who was turning about as if he had been stung by a tarantula. "It is the only answer I think it necessary to give," replied the minister, dryly. "Insist, Mr. Jules. Insist," said the banker. "In every possible way, Mr. Zambuco," replied Jules. And addressing the minister, who evidently intended to maintain extreme reserve, "May I ask you one question?" he said. "Only one?" "Yes, and I can answer it or not, as I please." "Is it within your knowledge that your father was ever in Egypt?" "No." "But if it was not Egypt, it might be Syria, or to be more precise, Aleppo. It will not be forgotten that it was in this town that Camelic Pasha had resided for some years before he returned to Cairo." After a moment of hesitation, Mr. Turcomel admitted that his father had lived in Aleppo, where he had met Camelic Pasha. There, no doubt, he had been of service to the Pasha, as had Thomas Antifer and Zambuco. "I will now ask you," continued Jules, "if your father received a letter from Camelic Pasha." "Yes." "A letter in which there was some mention of the position of an island in which treasure was buried." "Yes." "And did not this letter contain the latitude of this island?" "Yes." "And did it not say that one day a certain Antifer and a certain Zambuco would come and see you on this subject?" "Yes." Every yes fell like a hammer stroke, louder and louder. "Well," continued Jules, "Captain Antifer and the banker Zambuco are in your presence, and if you will show them the Pasha's letter, they will have only to make a note of its contents and be off to fulfill the intentions of the testator, of which you and they are the 3 legatees." As Jules spoke, Captain Antifer struggled in vain to keep still. The minister paused before he replied. "And when you have reached the place where the treasure is, what are your intentions?" "To unearth it, of course," said Antifer. "And when you have unearthed it?" "To divide it into 3 shares." "And what are you going to do with your shares?" "Whatever we please." "That is it, gentlemen," replied the minister, while his eyes glowed like fire. "You intend to take advantage of these riches to satisfy your instincts, your appetites, your passions. That is to say, to contribute towards the increase of the inequities of the world." "Allow me," interrupted Zambuco. "No, I will not allow you, and I ask you this simple question. If this treasure falls into your hands, will you undertake to destroy it?" "Each will do with his legacy as he judges best," said the banker evasively. Antifer exploded. "That is not it, at all," he shouted. "Do you know what this treasure is worth?" "It makes no difference." "It is worth £4,000,000, and there's a third of that for you." The minister shrugged his shoulders. Are you aware that you are not allowed to refuse us the information the testator requires you to give? Really? Do you know that you have no more right to leave 4 millions unproductive than to steal them? That is not my opinion. Do you know that if you persist in your refusal, yelled Captain Antifer in a fury, we shall not hesitate to bring you to justice, to denounce you as a fraudulent legatee, as a criminal. As a criminal, repeated the minister angrily, but cool. Really, gentlemen, your audacity equals your absurdity. Do you imagine that I shall agree to spreading 4 millions over the earth to become the cause of 4 million sins the more? To stultify all my teachings and give my congregation the chance of flinging 4 millions in my face? Jules could not help admiring the preacher, while his uncle, wild with anger, was ready to spring on him. Yes or no, hissed Antifer, clenching his fists and stepping forward. Yes or no, will you give us the Pasha's letter? No. Antifer foamed at the mouth. No? No. Ah, I will make you give it to us. Jules interposed. His uncle pushed him aside. Antifer would have strangled the minister, searched the rooms, ransacked the cupboard, and it would not take him long to do so. But he was stopped dead by this simple and peremptory reply. It is useless for you to search for the letter. And why? Asked Sambuco. Because I have not got it. What have you done with it? I have burnt it. He has put it to the fire, gasped Antifer. The wretch! A letter containing the secret of 4 millions. A secret never to be discovered now. And it was only too true. Doubtless for fear of being tempted to make use of it, a use contrary to all his principles, the reverend gentleman had burnt the letter several years before. And now you can go, said he, showing his visitors the door. Antifer was overwhelmed at the blow. The document destroyed? The finding of the island impossible? And so it was with Sambuco, who burst into tears, like a child deprived of his plaything. Jules had to help the two legatees out onto the stairs, then into the road, and then, sorrowfully, they went back to the hotel. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 29. Such emotions, disasters, anxieties, troubles, shocks, and alternations of hope and despair were too much for Captain Antifer. Even the constitution of a coasting captain has its limits. And as soon as Jules' much-harassed uncle reached the hotel, he took to his bed. He was attacked by fever, a violent fever, with delirium, the consequences of which might be serious. What deceptive illusions haunted him? This campaign interrupted just at the moment when it promised to end successfully. The uselessness of further search, this enormous treasure in which they would never know the position, this third island lost in some unknown sea, the only document that can give its exact position destroyed, burned by this abominable minister. This latitude, which not even torture would make him disclose, and which he had voluntarily and criminally forgotten. Yes, it was to be feared that Antifer's much-troubled mind would be unable to resist this last blow. And the doctor called in haste, gave it as his opinion that there was every likelihood of the patient going mad. Every care was taken of him. His friend Tregamain and his nephew Jules would not leave him for a moment, and, if he recovered, would be entitled to his warmest gratitude. As soon as he returned to the hotel, Jules had informed Ben Omar, and through him Saouk learned all about Mr. Turcomel's refusal. The fury of the false Nazim can be imagined, but this time there was no outward manifestation of his anger. He kept it to himself, hoping that the secret which Antifer could not discover might be discovered by himself, and utilized for his sole advantage. This was the object on which he concentrated his attention, and during that day and the subsequent days, he was not seen at the hotel. When the bargeman heard what had happened, he remarked, "I think the matter is buried at last." "I think so too," said Jules. "It seems impossible to get anything out of this obstinate fanatic." It is rather funny, though, to take millions to a minister and find him refuse them. Take millions, exclaimed the young captain, shaking his head. You do not believe in them, Jewel? You may be wrong. How you have changed. Since the finding of those diamonds. I do not say that the millions are on the third island, but they may be there. Unfortunately, if this clergyman will not listen to anything, we shall never know. Well, no, Mr. Tregomain, and in spite of the 2 diamonds at Mayumba, nothing will prevent my thinking that the Pasha has a huge hoax in store for us. In that case, your poor uncle will suffer. What we have to do now is to get him well. Let us hope his head will stand it. When we have set him on his feet again, and he is strong enough to travel, he will, I think, agree to return to France, and resume his former quiet life. Ah, said Jewel, would we were only in the house in the Rue des Hauts-Celestes. And you near our little Enegate, my boy. By the way, did you think of writing to her? I wrote this morning, and said I thought we might now talk of coming home. A few days elapsed. The patient had become no worse. The fever had decreased, but the doctor was uneasy as to the mental state of his patient. Antifer, though his head was weak, was able to recognize Tregomain and Jewel, and his future brother-in-law. Brother-in-law? Between ourselves, if any lady was in danger of remaining single, was it not Talisman Zambuco, now on the confines of 50, and waiting, not without impatience, for the appearance of her promised husband? No treasure, no husband, for one was the complement of the other. From all which, it resulted that neither the bargeman nor Jewel could leave the hotel. Antifer was always asking for them. Day and night he kept them in his room, listening to his complaints, his recriminations, and above all, his menaces against the horrible minister. He spoke of nothing else than going to law with him. The judges would know how to make him speak. He could not keep silent when it meant keeping 4 millions out of circulation. He would be punished most severely, most terribly, might even be hanged, etc., etc. From morning to night, Antifer continued in this tone. Tregomain and Jewel took it in turns to be with him, except when some violent crisis required them both to be present. The patient would have got up, rushed out of his room, run away to the minister, and blown out his brains, if the bargeman's strong hand had not kept him down. Although he greatly desired to visit the superb city of Edinburgh, Tregomain had to give up the idea. Later on, when his friend was on the road to recovery, he would make up for it. He would visit the palace of Holyrood, the ancient residence of the Scottish kings. He would stroll along the Canongate to the castle, firmly planted on its rock, and see the little room in which the child came into the world who was to become James VI of Scotland and James I of England. He would make the ascent of Arthur's Seat and enjoy the view from its summit. Soon a rumor arose calculated to greatly increase Mr. Turcomel's already considerable popularity. It was reputed that the celebrated preacher had, in conformity with his expressed opinions, just refused a very large legacy. Perhaps the minister had himself started the rumor, which was so much to his advantage. At any rate, there was an immense crowd to hear his next sermon. This time, for a very good reason, Captain Antifer and his companions were not present. But behind one of the columns in the nave, there might have been recognized a foreigner whom nobody knew, of from 30 to 35 years of age, with black hair and beard, hard-featured, and of any but prepossessing appearance. Did he understand a language in which the minister spoke? We cannot say that he did. Standing hidden in the shade, he watched the preacher narrowly. His gleaming eyes never lost sight of him for a moment. The man remained in this attitude until the close of the sermon, and, when the last words were spoken, made his way through the crowd toward the minister. Did he intend to follow him from the church to his house in the Canongate? It would seem like it, from the vigor with which he used his elbows on the steps of the porch. That evening, Mr. Turcomel did not return alone. A small crowd accompanied him. The mysterious man was one of them, but did not join in their expressions of enthusiasm. On reaching his house, the popular orator ascended some of the outer steps and addressed the crowd, and then retired, without noticing that an intruder was at his heels. The crowd slowly dispersed, When the minister mounted the narrow staircase leading to the third floor, the unknown followed him as stealthily as a cat. The minister reached the landing, entered his room, and shut the door. The other stopped on the landing, cowered down in a dark corner, and waited. And then what happened? Next morning, the people in the house were surprised at not seeing the minister go out early as usual. They did not see him all the morning. Several visitors called and knocked at the door in vain. This appeared so suspicious that in the afternoon, one of the lodgers gave information to the police. The police came to the house, mounted the staircase, knocked at the door, and as they received no reply, broke it in, with that push from the shoulder peculiar to the officers of the force. What a spectacle! Someone had evidently picked the lock of the door, entered the room, and ransacked it from top to bottom. The cupboard was open and emptied of the few clothes it contained, which had been thrown on the ground. The table was upset. The lamp lay in a corner. Books and papers were scattered all over the floor, and near the bed, half-stripped, pinioned and gagged, was Mr. Turcomel. The police quickly set him free. He was only just breathing. He had quite lost consciousness. Since when? He alone could say, if he recovered. He was rubbed energetically. There was no need to take his clothes off, for he was almost naked. His shirt was torn from his back. His chest and shoulders were bare. The policeman who began to rub him could not restrain an exclamation of surprise. On Mr. Turcomel's left shoulder, some figures and a letter had been tattooed. The tattoo marks were legible enough, brown in color, on the minister's white skin. And this was the inscription: 77 degrees, 19 minutes north. As may be supposed, this was the much sought-for latitude. The minister's father, to prevent it being lost, had evidently had it tattooed on his son's shoulder when he was young, as if he had inscribed it in a notebook. A notebook might be lost, but not a shoulder. Thus it was that, although he had really burned the letter of Kamalik Pasha addressed to his father, the minister possessed this inscription so strangely placed, an inscription he had never had the curiosity to read with the aid of a looking-glass. But undoubtedly, the rascal who had entered the room while the minister was asleep had read it. The minister had found him ransacking his cupboard and looking over his papers. In vain had he struggled. After binding him and gagging him, the scoundrel had fled, leaving him half suffocated. Such were the details given by Mr. Turcomel, as soon as a doctor, summoned in haste, had restored him to consciousness. He related all that had passed. In his opinion, the sole object of the assault was to wrest from him the secret of the island of the millions he refused to disclose. The scoundrel, then, had found it out while struggling with him, and with regard to this, he spoke of the visit he had received from the two Frenchmen and a Maltese, come to Edinburgh to interrogate him regarding the legacy of Kamalik Pasha. Here was a clue for the police, who began their inquiries immediately. 2 hours afterwards, they discovered that the foreigners in question were at Gibbs Royal Hotel. And it was fortunate for Captain Antifer, Zambuco, Tregamain, Jewel, and Ben Omar that they could prove an incontestable alibi. Antifer had not left his bed. Jewel and the bargeman had not left his room. Zambuco and the notary had not been away from the hotel. And none of them answered to the description given by the minister. But there was Saouk. Saouk was the man. He it was who had gone to get the secret from Mr. Turcomel. And now, thanks to the figures he had found on that gentleman's back, he was master of the situation. He knew the longitude mentioned in the document found on the island in Mayuma Bay, and thus possessed the necessary elements for determining the position of the new island. Unfortunate Antifer! It needed but this last blow to drive him mad. In fact, after the description given in the newspapers, Captain Antifer, Zambuco, Tregamain, and Jewel had no doubt but that it was Nazim, this clerk of Ben Omar, with whom Mr. Turcomel had had to do. And when they learned that he had disappeared, they took it for granted that he had seen the figures that had been tattooed, and that he had started for the new island to take possession of the treasure. The least astonished of the party was Jewel, whose suspicions with regard to Nazim we know, and next to him, Tregamain, to whom the young captain had communicated his suspicions. The rage of Antifer and Zambuco was extreme, and it found a victim in the person of Ben Omar. We need scarcely say that Ben Omar was more certain than anybody of the guilt of Saouk. And how could it be otherwise, knowing as he did his intentions, and that he was the sort of man who would recoil at nothing, not even at crime? What a scene it was to which the notary had to submit. Jules fetched him to the sick room. Ill as he might have been, Antifer was not the man to remain ill under such circumstances. If, as the doctor said, he was suffering from bilious fever, here was a splendid opportunity for him to relieve himself of his bile and bring about his own recovery. We really cannot describe the way in which the unfortunate notary was treated. He was told, to begin with, that the assault on the minister and the robbery, yes, you miserable Omar, the robbery, was the work of Nazim. What? Is that the way you choose the clerks in your office? Is this the sort of man that you bring to assist you as an executor? A nice sort of rascal, scoundrel, villain to thrust upon us. And now this wretch, this unscrupulous wretch, had fled with the position of island number 3, and he would get hold of Kamalik Pasha's millions, and it would be impossible to lay hands on him. Ah, Saouk, Saouk! The name escaped the overwhelmed notary. All Jules' suspicions were confirmed. Nazim was not Nazim. He was Saouk, the son of Murad, disinherited by Kamalik for the benefit of the legatees. What? Exclaimed Jules. It was Saouk? Ben Omar would have recalled the name if he could. His face, his terror, his dejection showed only too clearly that Jules was not mistaken. Saouk, roared Antifer, jumping out of bed with a bound. And with a tremendous kick, he laid the notary flat on his back. This kick, with the broadside of abuse that followed it, was a real relief to Captain Antifer. And when Ben Omar, with his shoulders up and his stomach in, tottered out of the room, he felt considerably better. One thing more completed the cure, and that was the news that appeared in one of the newspapers a day or two afterwards. We know of what reporters and interviewers are capable. Of everything, it must be admitted. At this period, they had begun to intervene in public and private affairs with a vigor and audacity that had made them a new power in the world. One of them had been clever enough to obtain an interview with regard to the tattoo marks with which Mr. Turcomel's father had illustrated his son's left shoulder. He made a drawing of it, and this drawing appeared next day in a journal, the circulation of which, on that occasion, was so phenomenal that in a short time the whole world knew of the famous latitude, 17 degrees, 19 minutes north. The public were so much the wiser, for before they could solve the treasure problem, as it was called, they required the other element of the position, namely, the longitude. But Antifer had this longitude, and so had Saouk for that matter. And when Jules brought him the newspaper in question, and he saw the drawing, he jumped out of bed, he put on his clothes. He was cured as never a patient had been cured before. Jules, have you bought another atlas? Yes, uncle. The longitude of the third island is 15 degrees 11 minutes east, is it not? Yes, uncle. The latitude tattooed on the minister's shoulder is 17 degrees 19 minutes north, is it not? Yes, uncle. Well, see where island number 3 ought to be. Jules took the atlas, opened up the map of the Arctic regions, applied the compasses, and remarked, Spitzenbergen, the southern end of the large island. Spitzenbergen? What? Was it in this northern region that Kamalik had chosen an island for his millions? Was this the last island? Let us go, said Antifer, this very day, if we can find a ship ready. Uncle, exclaimed Jules, we must not let this miserable Saouk get there before us. You are right, my friend, said the bargeman. Let us go, repeated Antifer imperiously, and he added, Go and tell that fool of a notary, for Kamalik Pasha wanted him to be present at the discovery of the treasure. They had to bow to his will, supported as it was by the will of Zambuco. Well, said Jules, at any rate, it is lucky that this joker of a Pasha did not send us to the Antipodes. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 30. Captain Antifer and his 4 companions, including Ben Omar, had to go first to Bergen, one of the chief ports of Norway. No sooner resolved upon than done. Nazim, otherwise Sauk, had a start of 4 or 5 days, and not an hour was to be lost. The noonday ball had not fallen at Edinburgh Observatory when the tram deposited our 5 friends at Leith, where they hoped to find a steamer on the point of sailing for Bergen. The distance from Edinburgh to this port is only about 400 miles. From there it would be easy to reach Hammerfest, the northernmost Norwegian port, by means of the steamer which, in the summer season, takes tourists to the North Cape. From Bergen to Hammerfest is about 800 miles, and is about 600 miles from Hammerfest to the south end of Spitzenbergen. For this last stage, a vessel would have to be chartered fit for the voyage, but at this period of the year, there is no bad weather in that part of the Arctic Ocean. There remained the question of money. This third of the voyage would evidently be very costly, particularly that part of it north of Hammerfest. Tregemain's funds had begun to run low, after so much expenditure since leaving St. Malo. Fortunately, the banker's signature was as good as gold. There are people so favored by fortune that they can dip their hands into any money chest in Europe. Zambuco was one of these. He placed his credit at the disposal of his co-legatee. The brothers-in-law could adjust their accounts afterward. The treasure, and in default of the treasure, the diamond, of the one would yield more than enough to pay what the other had advanced. Before leaving Edinburgh, the banker had visited the Bank of Scotland, where he was cordially received. Thus laden, our travelers can go to the end of the world, and who knows if they would not have to go there if things went on as they had been doing. At Leith, situated a mile and a half from Edinburgh, on the Firth of Forth, there are always a number of vessels. If there was one outward bound for the coast of Norway, there was one. This time fortune seemed to favor Antifer. Though the said ship was not to start that day, she was due out next day. She was a trading steamer, the Viking. Here was a delay of 36 hours for Jules' uncle to fret about. He would not even allow Jules and Tregemain to take a stroll through Edinburgh, much to the disgust of the bargeman, notwithstanding the interest he had begun to take in the millions of the Pasha. On the 7th of July, the Viking left the docks, and 2 days afterwards sighted the heights of Norway, arriving at Bergen about 3 in the afternoon. We need scarcely say that before leaving Edinburgh, Jules had bought a sextant, a chronometer, and a nautical almanac, to replace those lost in the Port Alegre. If they could have chartered a vessel at Leith, direct for Spitzenbergen, they would have saved time, but the opportunity did not present itself. Antifer's impatience, however, was not tried overmuch. The steamer for the North Cape was expected next day, but the few hours seemed as long to him as they did to Sambuco. Neither of them would hear of leaving their hotel. Besides, it rained, for it seemed that it generally rains at Bergen, which occupies a sort of basin surrounded by mountains. This did not prevent the bargeman and Jules from taking a run through the town. Captain Antifer, quite recovered from his fever, did not insist on their remaining with him. But all that was worth seeing they had seen, when in the early morning the steamer came into harbor. At 10 o'clock she was off with her cargo of tourists, anxious to see the midnight sun on the horizon of the North Cape. This was a phenomenon of supreme indifference to Captain Antifer and Zambuco, and especially so to Ben Omar, who was in his usual state of collapse in his bunk. What most annoyed Antifer was the steamer's continual stoppages to satisfy the curiosity of the tourists. The thought that Sauk was several days in front of him kept him in a state of irritation that was anything but agreeable to his traveling companions. The remonstrances of Tregemain and Jules were of no avail, and the captain of the steamer threatened to put him ashore if it persisted in making himself a nuisance to those on board. Whether he liked it or not, Antifer had to put in at Drontheim, the old city of St. Olaf, which is not as large as Bergen, but more interesting. We need not be surprised at Antifer and Zambuco refusing to go ashore. Tregemain and Jules, however, took advantage of the delay to explore the town. If the eyes of the tourists were to a certain extent satisfied, their feet were not. The street might as well be paved with broken bottles, so pointed are the stones. Cobblers ought to make a fortune in this country, said the bargeman, judiciously trying in vain to save his soles from damage. The only acceptable pavement the two friends could find was under the arches of the cathedral, where the kings, after being crowned at Stockholm as kings of Sweden, come to be crowned as kings of Norway. After conscientiously visiting the cathedral and the vast cemetery that surrounds it, after following the banks of the wide Nid, whose waters, increased or decreased by the flow or ebb, flow through the town between long stockades of wood that serve as quays, after sampling the odors of the fish market, and visiting the vegetable market, almost entirely supplied from England, after venturing across the Nid to the suburb round an old citadel, Triggerman and Jewel returned on board quite tired out. A letter addressed to Enegate, containing a pleasant postscript in the heavy handwriting of the bargeman, was that evening put in the post for St. Malo. Next morning, at daybreak, the steamer left, with a few new passengers, and resumed her voyage to high latitudes. There were more stoppages, more delays, much to the disgust of Antifer. In crossing the Arctic Circle, represented by a thread stretched across the deck, he refused to jump over it, though Triggerman good-humoredly complied with the tradition. At last, in advancing northward, the steamer avoided the famous maelstrom, whose roaring waters turned in a gigantic whirlpool. Then the Lofoten Islands, so much frequented by the Norwegian fishermen, appeared to the west, and on the 17th, anchor was dropped in the port of Tromsø. To say that during the voyage it had rained 16 hours out of the 24 would be only just, according to the figures. But the verb to rain is quite insufficient to give an idea of such deluges. Anyhow, these cataracts were not displeasing to our travelers. They showed that the temperature was relatively high, and what was to be feared by men bound for the 77th parallel was the prevalence of the Arctic cold, which would have rendered very difficult, and even impossible, the approaches to Spitzenbergen. This period of the year, July, is late for navigation in these parts. The sea might suddenly close in at a change of wind, and if Antifer were detained at Hammerfest until the early ice had drifted south, would it not be dangerous for him to venture further north in a fishing boat? The thought of this made Jewel anxious. And if the sea does close in, asked Triggerman, my uncle will have to winter at the North Cape and wait for next season. Well, my boy, we must not abandon the millions. The old mariner of the Rance no longer growled. And why not? He cannot get those diamonds found in Mayuma Bay out of his head. But having been roasted under the sun of Luongo, was he to be frozen among the glaciers of Spitzenbergen? Confound that Pasha! What possessed him to bury his treasure in such extraordinary places? The steamer stayed but a few hours at Tromsø, where the passengers could for the first time make acquaintance with the natives of Lapland. And on the morning of the 21st of July, she entered the narrow fjord of Hammerfest. There, Antifer and his party landed. Next day she would take the tourists on to the North Cape. Little did Antifer care for the North Cape. There was no North Cape worth comparing, as far as was concerned, with island number 3, somewhere in Spitzenbergen. But as there happened to be a North Pole hotel at Hammerfest, it was to the North Pole that they went. As soon as they had engaged their rooms, they went out, in their anxiety not to lose a moment, to endeavor to charter a boat to take them to Spitzenbergen. They walked towards the harbor, which is fed by the limpid waters of a lovely river bordered with stockades, on which were built houses and warehouses, the whole pervaded by the odors from the neighboring fish-drying establishments. Hammerfest is above all things the town of fish and every fishing product. The dogs eat it, the cattle eat it, the ship and goats eat it, and the hundreds of boats which work in these wonderful regions bring more fish than can be eaten. A curious town in Hammerfest, rainy as it might be, lighted by the long summer days, darkened by the long winter nights, and often illuminated by sheaves of the aurora borealis of inexpressible magnificence. At the entrance of the harbor, Captain Antifer and his companions stopped at the foot of a granite column with a bronze capital bearing the arms of Norway, and surrounded by a terrestrial globe. The column was erected by Oscar I, and is commemorative of the measurement of the meridian between Hammerfest and the mouths of the Danube. From this point, our travelers directed their steps toward the stockades, at the foot of which were moored the vessels of all rigs and every tonnage employed in the major and minor fisheries of the Polar Sea. But you may ask, how were they to make themselves understood? Did any of the party understand Norwegian? No, but Jewel understood English, and with the aid of that cosmopolitan language, there was every chance of his making himself intelligible in Scandinavian. In fact, before the day was over, they had on moderate terms chartered a fishing boat, the Kroon, of about 100 tons, commanded by Captain Olaf, and manned by a crew of 11. This would take the passengers to Spitzenbergen, wait there for them during their search, load up with any merchandise they might find, and bring them back to Hammerfest. This was fortunate for Antifer. It seemed that everything was going in his favor. Jules inquired if a foreigner had been seen at Hammerfest a few days before, if anybody had embarked for Spitzenbergen, and received replies in the negative to both questions. It seemed to Saouk, oh, you miserable Omar, had not got in front of them, or that he had gotten to island number 3 by a different route. The rest of the day was spent in walking about the town, Antifer and Sambuco being persuaded to do so on this occasion, as they were so near their goal. When they retired to rest at 11 o'clock, it was still day, and the twilight did not end before the dawn appeared. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the Kroon was off northward before a good southeasterly breeze. As there were some 600 miles to traverse, she would be about 5 days on the voyage, if the weather continued favorable. There was no fear of her having to meet with ice drifting southwards, nor of their finding Spitzenbergen surrounded by pack ice. The temperature remained at normal, and the prevailing winds rendered a sudden cold blast unlikely. The sky, dappled with clouds, which occasionally dissolved in rain, not snow, had nothing disquieting in its appearance. Now and then the cloud broke, and the sun's rays shot through the rifts. Jules had every reason to hope that the radiant disk would be visible when it became necessary to use the sextant for fixing the position of the third island. Evidently their good fortune continued, and there was nothing to lead them to think that after bringing his legatees to the uttermost part of Europe, Kamlik Pasha would send them once more several thousand leagues away. The Kroon went splendidly, the wind never failing her. Captain Olaf averred that he had never made a better passage. At 4 o'clock in the morning of the 26th of July, high land was reported to the northward, above a horizon quite clear of ice. This was Spitzenbergen, which Olaf knew well, from having frequently fished in these regions. 20 years ago, Spitzenbergen was not often visited by tourists, but nowadays it is gradually being embraced in their round. The time is not far distant when return tickets will be issued for the Norwegian possession, as they are now for the North Cape, and may eventually be for the pole of the same name. As far as was then known, Spitzenbergen was an archipelago extending to the 80th parallel. It is composed of 3 islands, Spitzenbergen, properly so called, the southeast island, and the northeast island. Does it belong to Europe or America? A question of purely scientific interest, which we need not stop to answer. One thing is certain, that it is chiefly Englishmen, Danes, and Russians who send their ships there for the whale and seal fisheries. It mattered little to the legatees of Kamlik Pasha, to whom these islands belonged once they had safely removed from them the millions earned by their courage and tenacity. Spitzenbergen, as the name indicates, is a land of pointed rocks, difficult to access. The islands were discovered by the Englishman Willoughby in 1553, and their name was given them by the Dutchmen Barents and Cornelius. Not only does archipelago consist of 3 principal islands, but these are surrounded by numerous islets. After marking on the chart the longitude of 15 degrees 11 minutes east and a latitude of 77 degrees 19 minutes north, Jules gave Captain Olaf orders to make for the southeast island, the most southerly of the archipelago. The Kroon scudded rapidly before a following wind, and the 4 or 5 miles which separated them from the islands were accomplished in less than an hour. The Kroon dropped anchor 2 cables off an islet which had a high abrupt promontory rising from its end. It was then 12:15. Antifer, Sambuco, Ben Omar, Tregamain, and Jules embarked in the boat and rowed toward the shore. An immense number of gulls, guillemots, and other polar birds flew off with deafening cries. A herd of seals rapidly shuffled off, not without protesting with mournful wailings against the intrusion. The treasure was evidently carefully guarded. Antifer leapt ashore and took possession. What curious good fortune after so many failures! He had not even to search amid the masses of rock. He had landed on the very spot where the Egyptian had buried his millions. The island was deserted, as need hardly be said. There was not a human creature on it, and there was not a ship in sight save the Kroon. Nothing but the immensity of the Arctic Sea. Antifer and Sambuco could hardly restrain themselves, and even the fishy eyes of the notary lighted up. Tregamain, more excited than he had ever been before, his back rounded, his legs far apart, was hardly recognizable. And after all, why should he not be happy at his friend's happiness? And what added to their joy was there was no mark of a footprint on the ground. Assuredly, no one had recently landed there. The ground, softened by the rains, would have retained any footprint. There was no doubt then with regard to Sahuk. Murad's terrible son had not preceded the legitimate owners of the treasure. Either he had been stopped on the way, or he had met with delays which would render his search useless if he arrived after Captain Antifer. When good fortune takes you by the hand, the best thing is to be led as she wishes you to be. Antifer was brought before a rock, rising like one of the landmarks set up by Arctic explorers. Here, here, he exclaimed in a voice choked with emotion. They ran up. They looked. On the outer face of this rock appeared the monogram of Kamalik Pasha, the double K, so deeply incised that the rigors of the polar climate had not worn away its lines. All remained silent at first, as if they had arrived before the tomb of some hero. And then they set to work. This time pick and mattock rapidly made the chips fly at the foot of the rock. At every blow they expected the tools would ring on the metal hoops of a barrel, or stick into a stave. Suddenly Antifer's pickaxe grated against something. At last, he shouted, removing the piece of rock which covered the hole in which the treasure lay. But to this cry of joy succeeded the cry of despair, a cry so loud that it might have been heard for half miles around. In the hole was a box, a metal box marked with the double K, a box just like those that had been found in the Gulf of Oman and in the Mayumba Bay. Again, groaned the bargeman, lifting his arms on high. That was the word. Yes, again. And again it would undoubtedly be necessary to go in search of another island. Antifer, in a furious passion, seized his pickaxe and dealt the box such a violent blow that it flew into splinters. From it escaped the parchment, spotted, stained, dilapidated, the damage due to the infiltration of rain and snow. This time there was not even a diamond for Turcomel, who had not been subject to expenses like his co-legatees. That was fortunate. A diamond for him? Why, he would have reduced it to vapor. But to our parchment. To pick it up, to unfold it carefully, for it might easily have torn, was what Jules did, for he alone retained his coolness. Antifer shaking his fist at the sky, Zambuco bowing his head, Ben Omar collapsing, Tregamain all eyes and ears. All were as silent as the grave. The parchment consisted of one sheet, of which the upper part had not suffered from the damp. On the sheet several of the lines were still legible. Joel read them, almost without interruption. This is how they ran. There are 3 men to whom I am under an obligation, and to whom I wish to leave a token of my gratitude. If I have placed these documents on 3 different islands, it is that these 3 men, made acquainted with each other during their voyages, might be united in an indissoluble bond of friendship. If they have had a certain amount of trouble and fatigue in arriving at the possession of this fortune, they have not experienced as much as I have in keeping it for them. These 3 men are the Frenchman Antifer, the Maltese Zambuco, the Scotsman Turcomel. In their default, if death has removed them from this world, their natural heirs will enjoy the same right to my legacy. In the presence, then, of the notary, Ben Omar, whom I have appointed my executor, this box having been opened, and notice having been taken of this document, which is the last, the co-legatees can proceed to the 4th island, where the 3 casks, containing the gold and precious stones, have been buried by my own hands. Notwithstanding the disappointment they felt at finding another voyage necessary, Antifer and the others could not help a sigh of relief. At least the 4th island was to be the last. But where was it? To find this island, continued Jewel, all that is necessary is to bring... Unfortunately, the lower part of the parchment had rotted away. The sentences were illegible. Most of the words had disappeared. The young captain tried in vain to decipher them. Island, situated, geometrical law. Go on, said Antifer. But Joel could not go on. There were only a few doubtful words which he sought in vain to connect together. As to the figures of the latitude and longitude, there was not left a trace. Joel began again. Situated, geometrical law. At last he made out another word. Pole. Pole? He exclaimed. What? Is it at the North Pole? Unless it is at the South Pole, muttered the bargeman in despair. Evidently here was the expected hoax. The pole, now, the pole. Had ever a human being set foot on the pole? Antifer jumped at his nephew, snatched from him the document, tried to read it, stumbled over the few words that were only barely legible. Nothing to give him any indication of the whereabouts of the fourth island. He would have to give up all hopes of discovering it. And when he saw that the search was at an end, he was struck as if by lightning and fell rigid on the ground. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 31. On the 12th of August, the house on the Rue des Hautes Célestes at St. Malo was in a state of rejoicing. There was a wedding that morning, and the happy couple had left about 10 o'clock for the Marie and the church, amid a numerous gathering of friends and acquaintances. Jules had married neither a princess, nor a duchess, nor a baroness. Enogate had neither married a prince, nor a duke, nor a baron. For want of the millions, their uncle's wishes had not been realized, and we have every reason to think that they did not regret it. Two other personages were radiant with joy. Nanon, who felt sure of her daughter's happiness, and Gildas Tregamain, in a lovely new coat and trousers, and a silk hat and white gloves, who was acting as best man. Quite so, but how about Captain Antifer? An hour after the discovery of the document on Island Number 3, which ended in such disappointment and despair, the passengers of the Croon had returned on board, Antifer being carried in the arms of the sailors, who had been called up to help. So shattered had he been by the blow that he spoke not a word. The return voyage was accomplished as quickly as possible by sea and land. The Croon took her passengers to Hammerfest. The steamer from the North Cape landed them at Bergen. The railway from Drothheim to Christiania not then being open, they had to travel by road to the Norwegian capital. A steamer took them to Copenhagen, and thence the railways of Denmark, Germany, Holland, Belgium, and France brought them to Paris, and so home to St. Malo. At Paris, Antifer and Zambuco bade each other farewell. Both were dissatisfied. Talisma Zambuco would probably remain single for the rest of her life. It was written above that it was not Antifer who was to save her from this undesirable position, against which she had struggled for so many years. It need scarcely be said that all the monies advanced to Antifer for the expenses of the voyage were repaid to Zambuco, and they amounted to a good round sum. But the sale of the diamond realized enough for there to be balance left, and Antifer had no cause of regret on this head. Ben Omar paid his own expenses, and departed for Alexandria by the shortest way, declaring that he would never again venture on a treasure hunt. The next morning, Antifer and Tregamain and Jules returned to St. Malo. And what a welcome they had! Nanon and Enogate had nothing but affectionate consolations for their brother, uncle, cousin, and friend. And then it was that Captain Antifer, finding it impossible to endow his niece and nephew with millions, gave his consent to their marriage. But he took no part in it, and would not even leave his room. In vain did Tregamain try to persuade him to be present at the wedding. You really ought to be there. Indeed. The young people do not like your being away. I beg that you will leave me in peace. And so the young people were married. They stayed at home only to leave it occasionally to visit the best of men, their friend Tregamain. There they often talked about Antifer and their sorrow at seeing him so irritated and cast down. He never went out. He saw nobody. No more walks for him on the ramparts. No more saunters along the quays, pipe in mouth. It was said that he was ashamed to show himself after such a failure, and there was a good deal of truth in this. I am afraid his health will give way, said Enogate, the tears coming into her eyes when she spoke of her uncle. And so am I, said Nanon, and every day I pray that heaven may grant that my brother may recover from his disappointment. That horrid Pasha, exclaimed Jules. What did he want to throw his millions at us for? Particularly millions we could not find, said Tregamain. But yet, They are somewhere. If only we could have made out the document to the end. One day, the bargeman said to Jewel, "Do you know what I think, my boy?" "What do you think?" "That your uncle would have been less upset if he had learned where the treasure was, even if he could not have put his hands on it." "Perhaps you are right, Tregamain. What makes him angry is that he had in his hand the document indicating the position of island number 4, and yet was unable to decipher the last lines." "There would have been no mistake about it this time," replied Tregamain. "The document was explicit on that point. Uncle has got it. He has it always under his eyes. He spends his time in reading it over and over again." "A waste of time, my boy, a waste of time. We shall never find His Excellency's millions. Never." A day or so after the wedding, they learned the news of what had happened to that rascal Saouk. The reason that he had not got to Spitzenberg before the others was that he had been arrested at Glasgow. The day of his attack on Turkomel, he had started for Glasgow, where he hoped to find a vessel sailing for Drothheim or Bergen. Instead of starting from the east coast of Scotland, as Antifer had done, he would go from the west. The distance was much the same, and he hoped to reach the island before the legatees. Unfortunately for him, he had to wait at Glasgow for a week before his ship started. And fortunately for human justice, he was recognized just as he was going on board. He was immediately arrested, and being sent to prison, was saved from a useless voyage to Spitzenbergen. The days rolled on. Jewel and Enegate would have nothing to mar their happiness had it not been for the truly melancholy state of their uncle. On the other hand, the young captain could not look forward without sorrow to the time when he would have to leave his wife and his friends. Le Bailiff's three-master was nearly finished building, and of her he was to be chief officer. It was a splendid position for a man of his age. In 6 months he would have to be at sea on a voyage to India. Jewel often talked about these things with Enegate, who was always sad at the thought of being separated from her husband. But in seaport towns, are not families accustomed to these separations? Enegate, not wishing to talk about herself, preferred to look at the matter as affecting only Captain Antifer. Would it not be cause of regret to his nephew to have to leave him in such a state, particularly as it was doubtful if he would find him alive when he came back? Jewel returned continually to the incomplete document, to the almost illegible lines in the old parchment. Yes, in these lines lay the beginning of a sentence which he tried again and again to decipher. All that is necessary is to bring what? And then these words: island, situated, law, geometrical, pole. What geometrical law? What was there that brought the 3 islands in connection? Had the Pasha chosen them at haphazard? Was it a mere whim that had sent the treasure seekers successively to the Gulf of Oman, Mayumba Bay, and Spitzenbergen? If the rich Egyptian had, as was reported, some knowledge of mathematics, had he been giving them some problem to solve? As to the word pole, did it mean the extremities of the Earth's axis? Certainly not. But then, what did it mean? Jewel racked his brain to obtain some answer to all this, but in vain. Pole, pole, he repeated to himself. That is the key to the mystery. Often he would talk about this to the bargeman, who approved of his endeavors, for he had no doubt as to the existence of the millions. But, my boy, he would say, there's no need for you to make yourself ill and try to find the solution. Well, Tregamain, it is not for my own sake, I assure you. I care not a fig for the treasure. But my uncle. Yes, for your uncle, Jewel. It is hard lines, certainly. To have there under his eyes the document, and not be able to... But have you no clue? No. And yet there is the word geometrical in the sentence. And it would not be without some reason that it would be there. And then it says, all that is necessary is to bring... What? That is it. What? And there is the word pole, which I do not understand the sense of. Unfortunately, I do not understand anything about it. I might help you if I did. 2 months went by. There was no change with regard to Antifer, and none with regard to the solution of the problem. One day, it was the 15th of October, before breakfast, Enegate and Jewel were in their room. It was rather cold, and a good fire was blazing in the grate. The young wife, with her hands in her husband's, was looking at him silently. Seeing him so absorbed, she wished to give another turn to his thoughts. "Jewel," said she, "you often wrote to me during this unfortunate voyage, which has brought us so much trouble. I read your letters over and over again, and I kept them carefully. They can only recall unpleasant remembrances now, my dearest." "Yes, but yet I have kept them, and I will always keep them. But these letters have not told me all that happened to you, and you have never told me about it yourself. Will you tell me today?" "What good would that be?" "It would please me. I should like to be with you on the steamers, in the train, in the caravan." "My darling, we should have to have a map so that I can show you our route from point to point." "Well, here's the terrestrial globe. Will that not do as well?" "Quite as well." Enogate went and brought the globe and set it on the table before the fire. Jules, seeing that it would please Enogate, sat down by her, turned the globe so as to bring Europe opposite to them, and pointed with his finger to the town of St. Malo. "Let us start," he said. And to begin with, Jules passed from France to Egypt, where Captain Antifer and his friends had stopped at Suez. Then his finger ran down the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, and stopped at Muscat. "And so Muscat is there," said Enogate. "And island number 1 is close by." "Yes, a little out in the Gulf." Then, turning the globe, Jules reached Tunis, where they met with the banker Zambuco. He traversed the Mediterranean, he stopped at Dakar, and he crossed the equator, descended the African coast, and paused at Mayumba Bay. "That is island number 2, said Enogate. "Yes, wifey." And then he went north again along Africa, and across Europe to Edinburgh, where he met Turcomel. Then his finger went further north until he reached the deserted rocks of Spitzenbergen. "That is island number 3, said Enogate. "Yes, island number 3, where we had the greatest disappointment we met with during this stupid adventure." Enogate said nothing, but kept her eyes fixed on the globe. "Why did your Pasha choose these 3 islands, one after the other?" "That is what we do not know, and what we shall probably never know." "Never?" "And yet these islands ought to be connected by some geometrical law, if we are to believe the last document. And then there is the word pole, which bothers me." As he spoke, Jules seemed to fall into a kind of trance, as though his whole mind was concentrated on the solution of this obscure problem. And while he remained silent, Enogate amused herself by tracing with her finger the route he had traveled. Placing her finger at Muscat, she moved it along to Mayumba, and then in the same curve ran up to Spitzenbergen, and returned to the point of departure. "That is a circle," she said with a smile. "You have been traveling on a round." "On a round?" "Yes, a circumference, a circular voyage." "Circular!" exclaimed Jules. He jumped up and took 2 or 3 turns across the room, repeating the words. "Circumference! Circumference!" Then he stepped toward the table, took the globe, ran his finger round it, and uttered a cry. Enogate was frightened, and looked at him anxiously. Was he going mad, like his uncle? She looked and trembled, the tears in her eyes. Jules uttered a second cry. "I have found it! I have found it!" "What?" "Island number 4. Surely the young captain had gone out of his mind. Island number 4? Impossible. "Tregamain! Tregamain!" shouted Jules, opening the window and calling in his neighbor. Then he returned to the globe. A minute afterwards the bargeman was in the room, and Jules greeted him with, "I have found it." "What have you found, my boy?" "I have found how these islands are geometrically connected, in the place that ought to be occupied by island number 4. "Can it be possible?" replied Tregamain, and looking at Jules he wondered, like Enogate, if the young captain had gone mad. "No," replied Jules, who understood the look. "I have not gone out of my mind. Listen." "I am listening." "These 3 islands are situated on the circumference of the same circle. Join them, 2 and 2, by straight lines. Bring them together, as the document says, and raise a perpendicular from the middle of each line. The perpendiculars will meet in the center of the circle, and that is the central point, the pole where we shall find island number 4. A very simple problem of geometry, as we see, which Camelique and Captain Zo had put into practice. The solution had not previously occurred to Jules, because he had not noticed that the 3 islands occupied 3 points of the same circumference. And it was Enogate's pretty finger which had traced this thrice-blessed circumference and solved the problem. "It is not possible," said the bargeman. "It is so. Look again, and convince yourself." It did not take long to convince him. The young captain ran to and fro, no longer able to restrain himself, and kissed the globe, and kissed Enogate's 2 cheeks, which were much fresher than the painted cardboard, and said, "She found it, Tregamain. She found it. Without her, the idea would never have occurred to me." And then Tregamain became attacked by a sort of delirium jubilans. He began to kick out his legs and round his arms with the grace of a sylphide of 30 stone, and rolling from port to starboard more than he had ever done on the Charmante Amélie between the banks of the Rance, or on the Porte Alegre with her cargo of elephants, he roared out, "I have my long, long, long. I have my jid long jid. I have my long, have my jid. I have my longitude." But at length he calmed down. "We must tell Uncle," said Enegate. "Tell him," said Tregamain, a little surprised at the proposal. "Is it wise for us to tell him?" "That requires reflection," replied Jules. They called Nanon. The old Breton was told how things stood in a few words, and when Jules asked if they ought to tell her brother, she replied, "We ought to not hide anything from him." "But if another disappointment awaits him," said Enegate, "he will not be able to bear it." "A disappointment this time? Certainly not." "The last document said the treasure was buried on island number 4, said Jules. "And island number 4 is situated in the center of the circle we have traveled. I am sure of it." "I will go and see my brother," said Nanon. A moment afterwards, Captain Antifer appeared in the room, his eyes haggard, his look gloomy, his brows knit. "What is the matter?" he asked. Jules explained what had passed, how he had first discovered the geometrical line united the 3 islands, and the reason why island number 4 must necessarily be in the center of that circle. To the surprise of everybody, Antifer took matters quite coolly. He seemed to have been waiting for the news, as though nothing was more natural than that he should hear it sooner or later. "Where is this central point, Jules?" was all he asked. Jules placed the globe on the table. With a flexible rule in his hand, he joined Muscat to Mayumba, and Mayumba to Spitzenbergen. From the middle of each line he drew a perpendicular, and the perpendiculars crossed in the center of the circle in which the islands were placed. The center was in the Mediterranean, between Sicily and Cape Bon, close to the island of Pantelleria. "There it is," said Jules. "There it is." And carefully going over the position again, and noting the meridian and parallel, he said in a firm voice, 37 degrees, 26 minutes north latitude, 10 degrees, 33 minutes east longitude. "But is there an island there?" asked Tregamain. "There ought to be," said Jules. "Is there one there?" "That is it exactly, Tregamain," said Antifer in a voice that made the windows rattle. "Exactly. It wants but that." And he rushed out, shut himself up in his own room, and did not appear again during the day. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey. Chapter 32. What did all this mean if Antifer had not gone mad? During the following days he resumed his walks on the ramparts and along the harbor, smoking his pipe and grinding away at his pebbles. He was no longer the same man. A sort of sardonic smile was stereotyped on his lips. He made no allusion to the treasure, nor to his travels, nor to the final expedition which would enable him to put his hands on the much sought-for millions. Tregamain and the others did not return to the subject. Every moment they expected Antifer to give them their marching orders, but he said not a word. "What can it mean?" asked Nanon. "A change has come over him," said Jules. "Perhaps he is afraid of having to marry Miss Sambuco," suggested the bargeman. "But that does not matter. It will never do to leave all those millions there." If Antifer's opinions had changed, it was evident that Tregamain's had. He it was who was now seized with thirst for gold, and yet he was logical. When they did not know if they would find an island, they went in search of it. Now that they knew where the island was, Why should they not be off? Tregermain was constantly talking to Jewel about it. What is the use? Asked the captain. He spoke about it to Nanan. Bah, said she, leave the treasure where it is. He spoke to Enegate. Look here, my little one, there's more than 1,000,000 to put in your pocket. Well, Mr. Tregermain, there is a kiss for you, and that is worth more. At last he resolved to mention the matter to Antifer, and a fortnight after the last scene, he did so. Ah, there's that island, What island? The island in the Mediterranean. It exists, I suppose. Exists? I am more certain of its existence than I am of yours and mine. Then why do we not go there? Antifer's reply was so oracular that Tregermain tried in vain to understand it. But he was not discouraged. After all, the millions were not for himself, but for the young people who were not thinking of the future. He would think of it for them. And so he persisted, and one day Antifer said to him, So it is you who want to go? Yes, I want to go. Your opinion is that we ought to go. We ought to go, and better today than tomorrow. Very well, let us go. But before starting, it was necessary to come to some determination regarding Zambuco and Ben Omar. Their positions as co-legatee and executor required that they should be present at the discovery of island number 4, and they were invited to be at the island on a certain day, the one to take his share, other to take his commission. Antifer would have everything done in order. 2 letters were sent, to Tunis and Alexandria, making an appointment for a meeting to take place on the 23rd of October at Girgenti in Sicily, the nearest town to the island. Turcomel's share would be sent to him in due course, and he could do what he liked with it. Throw it into the Firth of Forth, perhaps, if he was afraid of it burning his fingers. When the voyage was decided on, no one will be astonished at Tregermain having to be one of the party. What is more surprising is that Enegate had also to go. Jewel had only been married 2 months, and he would not consent to leave his wife behind. How long would this new exploration last? Not long. They only had to go and return. They had no 5th document to search for. It was certain that Camalik Pasha had not added other links to the chain of islands, which was long enough already. No, the statement was definite. The treasure was under one of the rocks at island number 4, and this island was mathematically placed between the coast of Sicily and the island of Pantellaria. Only it cannot be of much importance, for it is not marked on any of the maps, said Jewel. Probably not, replied Antifer with a grin that would have done credit to Mephisto. Really, it was incomprehensible. It was decided to go by the shortest road, which was the railway. There existed already an uninterrupted line of rails across France and Italy, from St. Malo to Naples. Expense was no object, considering the millions that were in view. On the morning of the 16th of October, Nanan bade goodbye to the travelers, who started by the first train. At Paris, where they did not stop, they took the fast train to Lyons, crossed the Franco-Italian frontier, saw nothing of Milan, or Florence, or Rome, and reached Naples on the 20th of October. Tregermain was as confident of the result of this new expedition as he was exhausted by 100 hours of shaking in a railway carriage. Leaving the hotel in the morning, Captain Antifer and his companions took passage on a steamer sailing for Palermo, and after a fine day's crossing, landed in the Sicilian capital. Do not imagine that there was any talk of visiting the local attractions. This time, not even Tregermain thought of bringing away a fugitive remembrance of this last voyage, nor of piously assisting at those Sicilian vespers he had heard of. As far as he was concerned, Palermo was not the famous city captured in turns by Normans, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Englishmen. It was merely the point of departure of the public conveyances, which run twice a week to Corleone in 9 hours, and from Corleone to Girgenti, also twice a week, in 12 hours. It was at Girgenti that our travelers had business, and it was in this ancient Agrigentum, situated on the southern coast of the island, that they were to meet Zambuco and Ben Omar. This means of locomotion might be subject to certain incidents or accidents. The post roads are not very safe. There are still brigands in Sicily. There always are. They flourish like olive trees or aloes. But nevertheless, the coach started next day, and the journey was accomplished without adventure. They reached Girgenti in the evening of the 24th of October, and if they had not reached their goal, they were at least very near it. The banker and the notary were already there, one from Tunis, the other from Alexandria. O inextinguishable thirst for gold, of what art thou not capable? As they met, the co-legatees exchanged but these words: Sure of the island this time? Sure. But what a sarcastic tone was Antifer's reply, and what an ironical look he had in his eye. To find a boat of some sort at Girgenti was not difficult. Fishing boats there are many, and coasting vessels also. Balancels, tartans, feluccas, sperinaires, and every other sort of Mediterranean rig. Besides, all they wanted was a short excursion on the sea, a mere trip of 40 miles or so to the westward. With a fair wind they could start that evening, and in the morning would be so near their island that they could land there before noon. The boat was soon engaged. Her name was the Providenza. She was a felucca of about 30 tons, commanded by an old sea-wolf, who in spite of his 50 years, still frequented these parts. And well he knew them. With his eyes shut, he could take a ship from Sicily to Malta, and from Malta to the coast of Tunis. There is no need to tell him what our business is, said Tregamain, and Joel thought it prudent not to do so. The name of the captain of the felucca was Jacopo Grappa, and it was fortunate for the travelers that he knew enough French to understand it, and make himself understood. And the travelers were fortunate in another respect. It was October. There were 1,000 reasons for expecting bad weather, a heavy sea, a cloudy sky. But no, the cold was already perceptible, the air was dry, the breeze blew from the land, and when the Providenza set sail, a magnificent moon poured its rays on the high Sicilian mountains. Grappa's crew consisted but of 5 men, enough for handling the felucca. The lifeboat flew over the quiet sea, a sea so quiet that even Ben Omar suffered no disturbance. The night passed without incident, and the dawn announced a superb day. Antifer's behavior was astonishing. He walked about the deck, hands in his pockets, pipe in mouth, affecting perfect indifference. Tregamain, in a great state of excitement, could hardly believe his eyes. The bargeman had taken up his position in the bow. Enegate and Jewel were side by side, Enegate enjoying the charm of the voyage. Ah, why could she not follow her husband wherever the chances of his sailor's life would take him? From time to time, Jewel would stroll up to the steersman to see that the Providenza was keeping on her course due west. At the rate at which she appeared to be going, he reckoned that she would be at the desired place about 11 o'clock. Then he would return to Enegate, a proceeding which once or twice brought him an admonition from Tregamain. Do not devote so much attention to your wife, Jewel. Give a little to our business. Notice that he said, our business. Oh, how he had changed. But was it not in the interests of his young friends? At 10 o'clock there was no sign of land, and in fact in this part of the Mediterranean, between Sicily and Cape Bon, there is no island of importance except Pantellaria. But they were not seeking an island of importance, nothing but an islet, a simple little islet. Grappa could not understand why the felucca was put on this course. Were his passengers bound for the coast of Tunis? But it did not matter to him. They had paid him well to go west, and he would go west as long as they asked him to. Are we to go west all the time? He asked Jewel. Yes. Very well. At 10:15, Jewel, sextant in hand, took his first observation. He found that the felucca was in latitude 37 degrees 30 minutes north, and longitude 10 degrees 33 minutes east. While he was at work, Antifer looked at him sideways and winked. Well, Jewel? We are in the right longitude, and we have to drop a few miles to the south. Then drop a few miles, nephew. Drop. I fancy that we shall never drop enough. The felucca was put on the port tack, so as to approach Pantellaria. Old Grappa, with his eyes screwed up and his lips pressed together, was lost in conjectures, and when Tregamain came near, he could not help asking him, in a low voice, what they were looking for in these parts. A handkerchief we had lost here, replied the bargeman, as if he were getting out of temper, if so excellent a man could do so. Very well, senor. At 11:45 there was still no mass of rocks in view, and yet the Providenza ought to be on the site of island number 4. Nothing. Nothing as far as the eye could reach. Joe went up to the starboard shrouds of the masthead. From there he could see for 12 or 15 miles around him. Nothing. Always nothing. When he returned to the deck, Zambuco, flanked by the notary, approached to him, and in an anxious voice asked, "Island number 4? It is not in sight." "Are you sure of your position?" asked Antifer in a jeering tone. "Sure." "Then it would appear that you no longer know how to take an observation." Jules flushed with anger, but Enegate calmed him with a supplicating gesture. Tregamain judged it wise to interfere. "Grappa," he said. "Signor, we are in search of an islet." "Yes, signor. Is there an islet anywhere near here?" "An islet?" "Yes." "Do you mean an island?" "An island," said Antifer, shrugging his shoulders. "Yes, an island. A pretty little island. An islet. An icky little islicky of an islet. Do you understand?" "Excuse me, Excellency, are you really looking for an island?" "Yes," said Gildas Tregamain. "Does one exist?" "No, signor." "No?" "No. But there used to be one, for I have seen it, and landed on its surface." "Its surface?" repeated the bargeman. "But it has disappeared." "Disappeared?" exclaimed Jules. "Yes, signor. 31 years ago, come San Lucia." "And what was this island?" asked Tregamain, clasping his hands. "Why," said Antifer, "it was Graham's Island." "Graham's Island? What a revelation to Jules!" "Yes, it was Julia Island, or Graham's Island, or Hotham's Island, or Ferdinandia, or Nerita, whichever name you please, which had happened on this spot on the 28th of June, 1831. What doubt could there be as to its existence? The Neapolitan Captain Carraro had been present at the very moment of the submarine eruption which had produced it. Prince Pignatelli had observed the column which burst in the center of the newborn island, with a continuous light as if it were a firework. Captain Ireton and Dr. J. Davy had been witnesses of this marvelous phenomenon. During 2 months the island, covered with ashes and hot sand, could be walked over. It was part of the seabed which plutonic forces had raised above the water level. In the month of December 1831, the rocky mass had sunk, the island had disappeared, and this portion of the sea had retained no trace of it. During this lapse of time, so short, ill luck had led Kamalik Pasha and Captain Zoe into this part of the Mediterranean. They sought an unknown islet, and they found one, which appeared in June and vanished in December. And now it was 50 fathoms down that the precious treasure lay. The millions which Turcomel would have hurled into the sea had got down into the sea of themselves, and would never be spread over the world. And Captain Antifer knew this. When Jules, 3 weeks before, had given him the position of island number 4, between Sicily and Pantellaria, he had at once recognized it as Graham's Island. When he was a youngster at sea, he had sailed in these parts, and knew all about the double phenomenon in 1831. The appearance and disappearance of an ephemeral island, now 300 feet below the level of the waves. When he had satisfied himself of this, after a fit of anger, the most terrible in his life, he had made up his mind to give up all hopes of ever obtaining the treasure of Kamalik Pasha. And that is why he had not spoken of resuming the search. If he had consented, under Tregamain's insistence, if he had plunged into the expenses of another voyage, it was only for his own self-esteem, to show that he was not the greatest dupe in the matter. The appointment he had made with Zambuco and Ben Omar was to give them the lesson which their duplicity toward him so well deserved. Turning toward the Maltese banker and the Egyptian notary, he said, "Yes, the millions are there, under our feet, and if you want your share, you have only to die for them. Come, Zambuco. To the water, Ben Omar." And if ever these two regretted their acceptance of Antifer's invitation, it was when he overwhelmed them with sarcasms, forgetting that he had been as keen as they were in the search of the treasure. "And now for the eastward," said Antifer, "and for home, where we will live so happily," said Jules. "Even without the millions of the Pasha," said Enegate. "We shall have to do without them," added Tregamain in a tone of comic resignation. And meanwhile, the young captain, out of curiosity, asked for a sounding to be taken. Grappa obeyed with a shake of the head. When the line had run out to a little over 300 feet, the lead struck a resisting mass. That was Graham's Island. That was island number 4, lost at this depth. At Jules' orders, the felucca wore into the wind. The wind being ahead, She had to beat to windward all night, and the morning was well advanced when the Providenza moored alongside the quay at Girgenti after this fruitless exploration. But as the passengers were taking leave of old Grappa, he said to Antifer, "Excellency? What is it? I have something to say." "Speak, my friend, speak." "Signor, all hope is not lost." Antifer drew himself up, and it was as though a look of supreme covetousness illuminated his glance. "All hope?" he answered. "Yes, Excellency. The island disappeared toward the end of the year 1831, but it has been rising ever since 1850. Like the barometer when fine weather is coming," said Antifer, with a loud shout of laughter. "Unfortunately, when it appears with its millions, our millions, we shall not be here. Not even you, Trademark, unless you die a centenarian many times over." "Which is hardly probable," replied the bargeman. "But it is true, as the old sailors said. The island is gradually rising to the surface of the Mediterranean, and a few centuries later it may be possible to have quite another ending to these wonderful adventures of Captain Antifer." The end. End of chapter 32. End of Captain Antifer by Jules Verne. Recorded by Joe DeNoia, Somerset, New Jersey.
Every story leaves a trace, some in history, others in the shadows. If this one made you think, question, or shiver just a little, you're in the right place. This is Truth Meets Fiction. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and don't believe everything you're told.